Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. In this video, I'm going to reveal the hidden daily routines of ancient Egyptians across every social class, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant. We'll explore what they ate for breakfast, how they handled their most private moments, what their work schedules looked like, and even how they entertained themselves when the sun went down. But first, let me give you a glimpse of just how detailed this reconstruction gets. We know exactly what time most Egyptians woke up, what they used instead of toothbrushes, and even how they dealt with workplace drama that would make your office politics look like child's play. So, let's start our day as an ancient Egyptian would have, right at sunrise along the life-giving waters of the Nile River. Picture this. It's approximately 3000 BCE, and the first rays of sunlight are creeping across the eastern horizon. For most ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just the beginning of a new day. It was literally the daily rebirth of the sun god Ra. And missing this moment wasn't really an option. Unlike our modern world, where we fight alarm clocks and hit snooze buttons, ancient Egyptians were naturally synchronized with the solar cycle in ways that would seem almost supernatural to us today. The average Egyptian family lived in a mud brick house that was specifically designed to work with the desert climate. These weren't the massive stone monuments we see in documentaries. We're talking about practical, efficient homes with flat roofs that served as extra living space, thick walls that kept the interior cool during scorching days, and small windows positioned to catch the breeze while keeping out the worst of the sandstorms. As dawn broke, the first person stirring in most households was typically the woman of the house. Now, before you start thinking this was because of some oppressive patriarchal system, the reality is far more practical. Egyptian women often controlled the household finances, ran businesses, and held significant social power. The early rising was simply because someone had to get the bread started, and in ancient Egypt, fresh bread wasn't just breakfast, it was literally the foundation of every single meal. But here's where it gets fascinating. The process of making this daily bread reveals so much about how these people lived. First, they had to grind grain using stone querns, which was back-breaking work that could take hours. The grain itself came from emmer wheat or barley, and the quality of your bread directly reflected your social status. Wealthy families had servants to do this grinding, while poorer families often had to wake up even earlier to get it done before the heat became unbearable. While the bread was being prepared, other family members were handling what we might call their morning routine, though it looked nothing like ours. Ancient Egyptians were actually incredibly concerned with cleanliness and personal hygiene, but they didn't have running water or modern plumbing. Instead, they used a system that was both ingenious and labor-intensive. Every morning, family members would wash using water stored in large pottery jars. This water had to be carried from the Nile or from local wells, and it was precious enough that every drop was used efficiently. They cleaned their teeth using frayed twigs, often from the Salvadora persa tree, which actually has natural antibacterial properties. Some wealthier Egyptians even had a kind of toothpaste made from ground pumice, salt, and mint. But perhaps most surprisingly, both men and women wore makeup every single day. And this wasn't just about vanity. The famous black coal eyeliner that we associate with ancient Egypt served multiple practical purposes. It helped protect their eyes from the harsh desert sun, it had antibacterial properties that prevented eye infections, and it was believed to provide spiritual protection from evil forces. The application of this makeup was actually a complex ritual that tells us a lot about Egyptian values. They used mirrors made from polished bronze or silver, and the wealthy had elaborate cosmetic sets with multiple containers for different substances. The kohl was made from ground galena or malachite mixed with animal fat or oil and applied with small sticks or brushes. Both men and women outlined their eyes dramatically, often extending the lines beyond the natural eye shape in styles that varied by region and time period. Once the morning preparations were complete, it was time for the first meal of the day, and this is where we start to see the massive differences between social classes that defined every aspect of Egyptian life. For a wealthy Egyptian family, breakfast might include fresh bread, honey, figs, dates, cheese made from goat or cow milk, and even meat left over from the previous day. They might drink beer, which was actually safer than water and was consumed by people of all ages, including children. This beer was thick, nutritious, and had a relatively low alcohol content, making it more like a liquid bread than the beer we know today. But for a typical farming family, breakfast was far simpler. Coarse bread, perhaps some onions or garlic, and weak beer or water flavored with herbs. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and fresh fruits were seasonal treats rather than daily staples. However, regardless of social class, every Egyptian family faced the same challenge as the day progressed, the relentless heat of the desert sun. This shaped everything about how they structured their daily activities, and it created work patterns that were completely different from anything we experience in our modern climate-controlled world. Most outdoor work had to be completed in the early morning hours, roughly from sunrise to about 10 a.m. As the temperature climbed, people would retreat to the coolest parts of their homes or find shade wherever possible. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. Working in the full heat of an Egyptian midday could literally be fatal, and everyone understood this fundamental truth. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of daily Egyptian life, their work. And contrary to popular belief, most ancient Egyptians weren't building pyramids. The pyramid building period was actually relatively short in Egypt's long history, and even during that time, the majority of the population was engaged in agriculture, crafts, trade, and various service industries that kept this complex civilization running. Let's start with the farmers, who made up about 80% of the population. Their daily routine was entirely dictated by the annual flooding cycle of the Nile River, which was so central to Egyptian life that their calendar was built around it. The year was divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, the flooding season; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. During Akhet, when the Nile flooded and covered the farmland with fertile silt, farmers couldn't work their fields, but this didn't mean they were idle. Many were recruited for public works projects, including the construction of monuments, temples, and yes, sometimes pyramids. Others worked on maintaining irrigation systems, preparing tools for the next planting season, or engaging in crafts that could be traded once the floods receded. When Pere arrived and the waters receded, farmers faced an incredibly intense period of activity. They had to plow the mud-softened fields using wooden plows pulled by oxen, plant their crops, and then begin the constant battle against pests, weeds, and the ever-present threat of drought or unexpected flooding. But here's where it gets fascinating. The process of making this daily bread reveals so much about how these people lived. First, they had to grind grain using stone querns, which was back-breaking work that could take hours. The grain itself came from emmer wheat or barley, and the quality of your bread directly reflected your social status. Wealthy families had servants to do this grinding, while poorer families often had to wake up even earlier to get it done before the heat became unbearable. While the bread was being prepared, other family members were handling what we might call their morning routine, though it looked nothing like ours. Ancient Egyptians were actually incredibly concerned with cleanliness and personal hygiene, but they didn't have running water or modern plumbing. Instead, they used a system that was both ingenious and labor-intensive. Every morning, family members would wash using water stored in large pottery jars. This water had to be carried from the Nile or from local wells, and it was precious enough that every drop was used efficiently. They cleaned their teeth using frayed twigs, often from the Salvadora persa tree, which actually has natural antibacterial properties. Some wealthier Egyptians even had a kind of toothpaste made from ground pumice, salt, and mint. But perhaps most surprisingly, both men and women wore makeup every single day. And this wasn't just about vanity. The famous black kohl eyeliner that we associate with
shaped by different pressures and opportunities. Take, for example, the daily life of a carpenter in ancient Thebes. His morning would begin much like the farmer's, with simple food and the application of protective kohl. But instead of heading to fields, he would walk to his workshop, carrying tools that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Egyptian carpenters used copper and bronze chisels, saws, adzes, and measuring tools that allowed them to create furniture, boats, coffins, and architectural elements with precision that still amazes modern craftsmen. Their daily work involved not just the physical labor of cutting and shaping wood, but also the complex logistics of obtaining materials in a desert environment, where good timber was often imported from Lebanon or Nubia. The social dynamics of these workshops were fascinating. Master craftsmen supervised apprentices in a system that was part education, part labor exploitation. Young scribes would be bound to masters for years, learning not just the technical skills of the craft, but also the business relationships, quality standards, and artistic traditions that would allow them to eventually establish their own workshops. But here's what's really interesting about Egyptian craftsmanship. It wasn't just about creating functional objects. Every piece was expected to meet both practical and spiritual requirements. A carpenter making a chair wasn't just concerned with whether someone could sit on it comfortably. He also had to ensure that the proportions, decorations, and even the wood selection aligned with Egyptian beliefs about harmony, protection, and the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. This spiritual dimension affected every aspect of daily work life in ways that might seem strange to modern people. Before beginning any significant project, craftsmen would often make offerings to Ptah, the god of craftsmanship, or to other deities associated with their particular trade. The workshop itself might contain small shrines where workers could pray for protection from accidents or for inspiration in their work. The working day for most craftsmen followed a pattern similar to the farmers: intense activity in the cooler morning hours, a long break during the heat of midday, and then a return to work in the late afternoon and early evening. But unlike farmers, whose work was seasonal, craftsmen had to maintain steady production throughout the year to meet the constant demand for their goods. This brings us to one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of ancient Egyptian daily life: the incredible complexity of their economy and the role of trade in shaping individual routines. Egypt wasn't an isolated civilization living in splendid isolation along the Nile. It was actually the hub of an incredibly sophisticated trade network that stretched from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean and from the Red Sea to the western oases of the Sahara. This meant that the daily lives of countless Egyptians were shaped by the constant flow of goods, people, and ideas through their communities. Consider the life of a merchant in ancient Memphis, one of Egypt's great commercial centers. His day would begin not just with the usual morning routine, but with a careful review of inventory, price calculations, and planning for the complex negotiations that lay ahead. Unlike modern commerce, where prices are fixed and transactions are standardized, ancient Egyptian trade was a highly personal, relationship-based system where every deal required extensive bargaining and social maneuvering. This merchant might be dealing with Nubian gold traders bringing precious metals from the south, Lebanese cedar merchants offering the high-quality timber that Egypt desperately needed, or local farmers bringing surplus grain to exchange for manufactured goods. Each transaction required not just business acumen, but also cultural sensitivity, language skills, and a deep understanding of the religious and social customs that govern different communities. But here's what makes Egyptian commerce so fascinating. They didn't use money in the way we understand it. Instead, they operated on a complex barter system, supplemented by standardized units of value based on weights of copper, silver, or grain. A merchant's daily life involved constant mathematical calculations, converting the value of different goods into these standard units and negotiating exchanges that satisfied all parties involved. The record-keeping alone was a massive undertaking. Egyptian merchants employed scribes to document every transaction, creating detailed papyrus records that had to account for quantities, qualities, dates, and the identities of all parties involved. These weren't just business records, they were legal documents that could be used to resolve disputes or collect debts, sometimes years after the original transaction. And speaking of scribes, let's dive into the daily life of perhaps the most envied profession in ancient Egypt. Becoming a scribe was one of the few ways for someone from a modest background to achieve real social mobility, and the training required was both grueling and transformative. A young scribe's day began with hours of practice copying hieroglyphic texts, learning not just the symbols themselves, but also the proper techniques for preparing papyrus, mixing inks, and maintaining the reed pens that were essential tools of the trade. This wasn't just penmanship practice, it was an intensive education in literature, mathematics, law, religion, and administration that could take a decade or more to complete. Master scribes worked in a variety of settings that shaped their daily routines in different ways. Some were attached to temples, spending their days recording ceremonies, managing temple finances, and copying sacred texts. Others worked for government administrators, documenting tax collections, legal proceedings, and official correspondence. The elite scribes served in the royal court, where their daily responsibilities might include drafting diplomatic letters, recording the pharaoh's decrees, or maintaining the complex genealogical and ceremonial records that legitimized royal authority. But regardless of their specific role, all scribes shared certain daily challenges that were unique to their profession. They had to maintain their materials in perfect condition, despite the harsh desert environment, protect their papyrus from insects and moisture, and ensure that their writing met the exacting standards expected in a culture where written records were considered to have magical as well as practical power. The social dynamics of a scribe's daily life were particularly complex because they operated at the intersection of different social classes. A scribe might spend his morning taking dictation from a wealthy noble, his afternoon mediating a dispute between merchants, and his evening teaching basic writing skills to the children of craftsmen who could afford private tutoring. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian society, the role of women in daily economic life. Unlike many ancient civilizations, Egypt offered substantial opportunities for economic independence and social influence. Though these opportunities varied significantly based on social class and family circumstances, wealthy Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, and engage in legal transactions with a freedom that wouldn't be seen in many other societies for thousands of years. A typical day for a prosperous merchant woman might involve supervising textile production in her workshops, negotiating contracts with suppliers, managing a staff of servants and workers, and maintaining the social relationships that were essential for business success. These women didn't just inherit their positions, many built their wealth through their own entrepreneurial efforts. Some specialized in luxury goods like perfumes, jewelry, or fine textiles. Others operated taverns, managed agricultural estates, or ran the complex household operations that supported wealthy families. Their daily routines required the same skills as their male counterparts: mathematical ability, negotiation skills, cultural awareness, and the physical stamina to manage multiple responsibilities throughout long, demanding days. But even women from more modest backgrounds had opportunities that might surprise modern observers. Many worked as professional mourners, entertainers, or religious functionaries. Others operated small businesses from their homes, producing bread, beer, textiles, or other goods that they sold in local markets. The daily life of a working woman in ancient Egypt was shaped by the same environmental challenges that affected everyone else, but with the additional complexity of managing family responsibilities alongside economic activities. A woman running a small bakery, for example, would have to coordinate her bread production with childcare, ensure that her ovens were properly maintained, despite the scarcity of fuel, manage relationships with grain suppliers and customers, and maintain the quality standards that could make or break her reputation in the local community. Now, all of these economic activities were supported by an infrastructure that required its own army of workers, whose daily lives were essential but often overlooked. The people who maintained Egypt's irrigation systems, transported goods along the Nile, operated the docks and warehouses, and provided the countless services that kept this complex society functioning.
And preparing for the complex navigation required to travel safely along a river that was simultaneously Egypt's lifeline and one of its greatest dangers. Navigation on the Nile required intimate knowledge of seasonal changes in water levels, shifting sandbars, dangerous currents, and the locations of the hippos and crocodiles that posed constant threats to river traffic. A boatman's daily routine involved not just the physical work of sailing, rowing, or pulling his craft, but also the mental challenge of reading the river conditions and making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between a successful journey and a catastrophic accident. The cargo these boatmen transported reveals the incredible diversity of goods that flowed through Egyptian society on a daily basis. A single boat might carry grain from Upper Egypt, gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from the Red Sea coast, and manufactured goods from workshops in Memphis or Thebes. The boatman had to understand the specific handling requirements for each type of cargo, manage the complex logistics of multiple stops along his route, and maintain detailed records of what was loaded and unloaded at each destination. But the Nile wasn't just a commercial highway. It was also the primary means of personal transportation for most Egyptians. This meant that boatmen also served as passenger carriers, connecting families separated by distance, enabling pilgrimages to important religious sites, and facilitating the social interactions that bound Egyptian communities together. The daily social life of ancient Egyptians was far richer and more complex than most people realize. After the working day ended, communities came alive with activities that served both entertainment and important social functions. Evening gatherings were central to Egyptian social life, and they took many different forms depending on the season, the community, and the social class of the participants. In farming villages, people might gather in courtyards or on rooftops to share the day's events, tell stories, play games, and enjoy whatever entertainment was available. Music was an integral part of these gatherings, and it reveals fascinating details about Egyptian values and daily life. Musicians used instruments like harps, flutes, drums, and sistrums to create music that accompanied singing, dancing, and storytelling.
But this wasn't just casual entertainment. Music was believed to have spiritual power, and many of the songs that filled Egyptian evenings were actually religious hymns or magical incantations designed to provide protection, ensure good fortune, or honor the gods. Dancing was equally important, and it served multiple functions in Egyptian society. Some dances were purely recreational, allowing people to celebrate, court potential partners, or simply enjoy physical expression after long days of labor. Others were religious rituals that were believed to communicate with deities, ensure successful harvests, or protect communities from harm. Games were another crucial element of Egyptian social life, and the variety of games they played reveals a society that valued both intellectual challenge and pure fun. Senet, perhaps the most famous Egyptian board game, was played by people of all social classes and was believed to have religious significance related to the journey through the afterlife. But Egyptians also played simpler games that children could enjoy, as well as more complex strategy games that challenged adult players. These evening social activities weren't just entertainment. They were essential mechanisms for maintaining community cohesion, transmitting cultural knowledge from one generation to the next, and providing the social bonds that help people cope with the challenges of daily life in a demanding environment. But perhaps most importantly, these gatherings provided opportunities for the kind of informal education that was crucial for most Egyptians. Children learned about their culture, their history, and their place in society, not through formal schooling, which was available only to a small elite, but through the stories, songs, and conversations that filled their evening hours. The seasonal nature of Egyptian life meant that these social patterns changed throughout the year in ways that created a rich and varied community calendar. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, communities had more time for elaborate celebrations, extended storytelling sessions, and the kind of intensive social interaction that strengthened relationships and resolved conflicts. Harvest time brought different kinds of gatherings, often focused on cooperative work that required community coordination. These weren't just economic activities, they were social events that combined necessary labor with celebration, competition, and the reinforcement of social bonds that would carry communities through the challenges of the coming year. Religious festivals provided another crucial structure for Egyptian social life, creating occasions when entire communities would come together for celebrations that could last for days. These festivals weren't solemn religious observances in the way we might imagine. They were joyous community celebrations that combined religious devotion with feasting, music, dancing, and the kind of social interaction that was essential for maintaining the complex relationships that held Egyptian society together. The daily preparation for these festivals reveals another important aspect of Egyptian life: the incredible amount of planning and coordination required to make their society function. Organizing a major religious festival required months of preparation, involving craftsmen who created decorations and ceremonial objects, farmers who provided extra food, musicians and dancers who prepared special performances, and religious officials who ensured that all the ceremonial requirements were properly met. This level of coordination was necessary for almost every aspect of Egyptian life, from the annual flood cycle that required community-wide cooperation to manage irrigation systems, to the complex trade relationships that brought goods from across the known world to Egyptian markets. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian daily life: how they managed to create and maintain one of history's longest-lasting civilizations despite facing challenges that would seem insurmountable to modern people. The coordination required wasn't just impressive from an organizational standpoint, it was absolutely essential for survival. Without it, Egyptian civilization would have collapsed within generations rather than lasting for over 3,000 years. And this brings us to perhaps the underappreciated aspect of daily Egyptian life: the incredible sophistication of their problem-solving abilities. Every single day, ordinary Egyptians had to navigate challenges that would stump most modern people. They had to predict weather patterns without meteorology, manage complex agricultural systems without modern tools, maintain public health without understanding germ theory, and coordinate massive construction projects without computers or even written mathematical formulas as we know them. Take something as basic as food storage, which was literally a matter of life and death in a civilization where a failed harvest could mean starvation for thousands of people. Egyptian families didn't just throw their grain into containers and hope for the best. They developed elaborate systems involving multiple types of storage, each designed for specific types of food and specific storage durations. They used jars sealed with beeswax and resin for liquids like oil and wine. They created underground storage chambers that maintained consistent temperatures despite the extreme heat above ground. They developed techniques for drying fruits and vegetables that preserved them for months without refrigeration. They even figured out how to store live fish in artificial ponds, creating a kind of ancient aquaculture system that provided fresh protein year-round. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't techniques developed by specialists and then distributed to the masses. These were skills that ordinary families passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, and adapted to local conditions. A farming family in Upper Egypt might have completely different food storage techniques than a merchant family in the Delta, but both systems would be incredibly sophisticated and perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. The daily maintenance of these systems required constant attention and expertise. Women often specialized in food preservation, spending hours each day monitoring fermentation processes, checking stored goods for signs of spoilage, and adjusting storage conditions based on seasonal changes. This wasn't just domestic work, it was highly skilled technical labor that required deep understanding of chemistry, biology, and engineering principles that these people couldn't name but absolutely understood. Men often focused on the construction and maintenance of storage facilities themselves, which required skills in masonry, waterproofing, ventilation design, and pest control that would impress modern contractors. They had to build structures that could withstand floods, earthquakes, extreme temperature variations, and the constant assault of insects and rodents that threatened stored food supplies. Children learned these skills through daily participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed a level of practical knowledge about food systems that far exceeded what most modern people understand about where their food comes from or how it's preserved.
Sophisticated problem solving appears in every aspect of Egyptian daily life. Consider their approach to personal hygiene and healthcare, which was far more advanced than most people realize. Egyptians didn't just wash themselves, they had developed complex systems for maintaining cleanliness that addressed both practical and spiritual concerns. Their daily bathing routines involved not just water, but carefully prepared soaps made from animal fats and plant-based alkalis. They used different cleansing agents for different parts of the body, understanding that skin on the face required different treatment than skin on the hands or feet. They had specialized preparations for hair care that protected against the harsh desert environment while maintaining the elaborate hairstyles that were important markers of social status. But beyond basic cleanliness, Egyptians maintained daily health practices that reveal sophisticated understanding of preventative medicine. They used various plant-based preparations to protect against common ailments, maintained dietary practices that modern nutritionists would recognize as sound principles, and engaged in physical activities that were designed to maintain strength and flexibility throughout their lives. The daily routine of an Egyptian family included time for what we might call physical therapy exercises, though they wouldn't have used that term. People regularly stretched, engaged in strength training using their daily work activities, and participated in games and dances that maintained cardiovascular health and muscular coordination.
Women often specialized in herbal medicine, maintaining gardens of medicinal plants and preparing remedies that addressed everything from minor cuts and bruises to serious illnesses. Their daily routines included checking and tending these medicinal gardens, preparing and storing various herbal preparations, and maintaining the knowledge systems that allowed them to diagnose and treat health problems within their families and communities. The sophistication of their medical knowledge was remarkable. They understood the importance of wound cleaning and had developed antiseptic preparations that actually worked. They knew how to set broken bones, treat various skin conditions, and manage pain using plant-based medicines that contained active compounds similar to modern pharmaceuticals. But perhaps most impressively, they understood the connection between mental and physical health in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Their daily routines included activities designed to maintain emotional balance, social connection, and spiritual well-being, recognizing that these factors were essential for overall health. This holistic approach to daily life extended to their work practices as well. Egyptian craftsmen didn't just focus on producing goods, they maintained work environments that supported both productivity and worker well-being. Workshops were designed to maximize natural lighting while minimizing heat exposure. Work schedules balanced intensive activity with adequate rest periods. Social structures within workshops provided support systems that helped workers cope with both professional challenges and personal problems. The daily routine of a workshop supervisor reveals just how complex these considerations could become. He had to coordinate the technical aspects of production, manage relationships between workers of different skill levels, ensure that quality standards were maintained, handle the business relationships with suppliers and customers, and maintain the workshop facilities themselves. But beyond these obvious responsibilities, he also served as a counselor, mediator, and community leader. Workers brought him personal problems that affected their ability to work effectively. He had to balance competing demands from different customers while maintaining fair treatment for his workers. He served as a link between his workshop and the broader community, representing his workers' interests in community decisions and ensuring that his business contributed appropriately to community needs. This multi-layered approach to leadership was necessary because Egyptian society was incredibly interconnected. A problem in one workshop could affect suppliers, customers, and competitors throughout the community. A skilled supervisor understood these connections and managed his daily activities with awareness of their broader implications. The same complexity appears in the daily lives of religious officials who served functions that went far beyond what we might expect from modern religious leaders. A typical temple priest's day included not just religious ceremonies, but also administrative duties, educational responsibilities, and community service obligations that made him a central figure in local society. His morning routine began before dawn with personal purification rituals that were far more elaborate than those required of ordinary Egyptians. He had to maintain higher standards of physical cleanliness, follow stricter dietary restrictions, and engage in daily meditation and prayer practices that prepared him for his various responsibilities. But once these personal preparations were complete, his day became a complex juggling act between different roles. He might spend the early morning conducting religious ceremonies, the late morning teaching children basic literacy and numeracy, the afternoon mediating disputes between community members, and the evening managing temple finances and coordinating with other religious officials. The educational role was particularly important because formal schooling was available only to a small elite. For most Egyptian children, the local priests provided their only access to literacy, basic mathematics, and the kind of general knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in their society. This educational process wasn't just about transferring information, it was about maintaining cultural continuity across generations. Through daily interactions with children and their families, priests ensure that Egyptian values, traditions, and practical knowledge systems were preserved and adapted to changing circumstances.
The daily teaching routine involved not just formal lessons, but also informal mentoring that helped young people understand their place in society and develop the skills they would need as adults. A priest might spend part of his day teaching a future scribe how to prepare papyrus, part of his day helping a young craftsman understand the religious significance of his work, and part of his day counseling parents about how to guide their children's development. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of a priest's daily life was his role in maintaining the complex religious systems that provided the spiritual foundation for Egyptian civilization. This wasn't just a matter of conducting ceremonies. It required deep understanding of theological principles, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and the kind of organizational skills needed to coordinate religious activities across multiple temples and communities. This level of coordination was possible only because Egyptian society had developed incredibly effective communication systems that allowed information to flow rapidly across the entire kingdom. The daily life of a royal messenger provides insight into how these communication networks actually functioned. A messenger's day began with careful preparation that was essential for both personal safety and message security. He had to plan his route based on current conditions along the Nile, seasonal variations in travel conditions, and political circumstances that might affect his safety in different regions. The physical demands of his work were enormous. Depending on the urgency of his message and the distance he had to travel, he might spend days traveling by boat, on foot, or using donkeys or other pack animals. He had to navigate not just geographical challenges, but also the complex social and political relationships that determined how he would be received in different communities. But beyond the physical challenges, messengers carried enormous responsibility for maintaining the information systems that held Egyptian civilization together. They transported not just official government communications, but also personal letters, business documents, religious instructions, and the kind of informal information that allowed widely separated communities to coordinate their activities. The daily routine of preparing, protecting, and delivering these messages required skills that combined physical endurance with intellectual sophistication. Messengers had to be able to read and write, understand the political implications of the information they carried, maintain absolute discretion about sensitive communications, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances that might require them to alter their plans or find alternative routes. Their work also required deep cultural knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in communities with different customs, dialects, and social structures. A messenger traveling from Memphis to Aswan would encounter dozens of different local communities, each with its own particular characteristics, and he had to understand how to approach local leaders, follow appropriate social protocols, and avoid misunderstandings
that could delay his mission or even put him in danger. This cultural sophistication was necessary because Egyptian civilization wasn't as uniform as we might imagine. While there were certainly shared values, religious beliefs, and social structures that unified the kingdom, there were also significant regional variations that reflected different environmental conditions, economic specializations, and historical experiences. The daily life of people in the Delta region was shaped by different challenges and opportunities than those faced by people in Upper Egypt or Nubia. Coastal communities had access to Mediterranean trade networks, but had to deal with different security threats. Desert oasis communities had developed specialized techniques for managing scarce water resources, but had limited access to some goods that river communities took for granted. These regional differences created opportunities for specialization and trade that enriched Egyptian civilization. But they also required sophisticated coordination systems that could manage the complexity without losing the benefits of diversity. The daily routines of local administrators reveal how this coordination actually worked at the practical level. A provincial governor's day involved balancing local needs with national requirements, managing relationships between different communities within his jurisdiction,
coordinating with other governors to address regional challenges, and maintaining communication with the royal court that kept central authorities informed about local conditions. His responsibilities included everything from tax collection and legal dispute resolution to infrastructure maintenance and military recruitment. But perhaps most importantly, he served as a cultural bridge between local communities and the broader Egyptian civilization, ensuring that regional variations remained within acceptable bounds, while allowing communities to adapt Egyptian institutions to their particular circumstances. This balancing act required enormous skill and constant attention to changing conditions. A governor had to understand not just the formal requirements of his position, but also the informal relationships and cultural dynamics that actually determined how effectively he could accomplish his goals. His daily routine included formal meetings with local officials, informal conversations with community leaders, personal interactions with ordinary citizens who brought him their concerns and complaints, and private time for planning and reflection that allowed him to stay ahead of developing problems. But beyond these obvious duties, he also had to maintain his own household, manage his personal relationships with family and friends, and participate in the social and religious activities that were essential for maintaining his standing in the community. The daily life of a high-ranking official wasn't just about exercising power. It was about maintaining the complex web of relationships that made effective governance possible. This same pattern appears throughout Egyptian society. Whether we're looking at farmers, craftsmen, merchants, priests, or government officials, their daily lives involved far more complexity and sophistication than we might expect from people living thousands of years ago. They had developed social institutions, economic systems, and cultural practices that allowed them to create and maintain one of history's most successful civilizations. They solved problems that would challenge modern societies, adapted to environmental conditions that would defeat less organized communities, and maintained cultural continuity across centuries of change and challenge. And they did all of this while dealing with the same basic human needs and desires that we face today. The need for food, shelter, and security. The desire for meaningful work and social connection. The challenge of raising children and caring for aging parents. And the universal human quest for purpose and meaning in daily life. The daily routines we've explored reveal people who were remarkably similar to us in their fundamental humanity, but who had developed very different solutions to the challenges of creating successful, sustainable communities. Their approaches offer insights that remain relevant today, reminding us that there are many different ways to organize human society, and many different definitions of what constitutes a good life. As we continue our exploration of ancient Egyptian daily life, we'll discover even more surprising details about how these remarkable people managed to create a civilization that lasted for over 3 millennia, adapting and evolving while maintaining its essential character through periods of prosperity and crisis, expansion and contraction, innovation and conservation. The evening hours in ancient Egypt revealed perhaps the most intimate and fascinating aspects of daily life, when the crushing heat finally subsided and communities came alive with activities that would surprise anyone who thinks these people lived simple, primitive lives. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Egyptian families didn't just collapse from exhaustion after their demanding days. Instead, they participated in a rich social world that was both deeply practical and surprisingly sophisticated. Picture a typical evening in a middle-class neighborhood along the Nile around 2500 BCE. As the temperature finally dropped to bearable levels, courtyards and rooftops throughout the community began filling with people engaging in activities that served multiple purposes simultaneously. This wasn't just leisure time. It was when the real business of maintaining social relationships, educating children, and preserving cultural knowledge actually took place. Food preparation for the evening meal was a community affair that revealed incredible details about Egyptian social structures and values. Unlike our modern world, where families eat in isolation, Egyptian evening meals were often shared events that involved multiple households, extended family members, and even neighbors who contributed different elements to create elaborate communal feasts. The process of preparing these evening meals required coordination that would impress modern event planners. Different families specialized in different aspects of the meal preparation, not just because of resource limitations, but because this specialization created social bonds that strengthened community resilience. One family might be known for their exceptional bread baking, another for their skill with vegetables, and another for their ability to prepare meat in ways that maximized both flavor and preservation. Women often took the lead in coordinating these meal preparations, but this leadership role extended far beyond simple cooking. They managed complex social negotiations about who would contribute what, how resources would be shared, and how the resulting feast would be distributed among participants. These negotiations required diplomatic skills that would be impressive in any context, because they had to balance practical considerations with social relationships, economic realities with cultural expectations. The actual cooking process was a technological marvel that most people completely underestimate. Egyptian cooks didn't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best. They had developed sophisticated techniques for controlling heat, managing cooking times, and combining flavors that created dishes far more complex than the simple bread and beer diet that most people associate with ancient Egypt. Their ovens were engineering marvels designed to maintain consistent temperatures despite limited fuel supplies and extreme environmental conditions. They understood fermentation processes that created not just bread and beer, but cheeses, preserved vegetables, and fermented sauces that added variety and nutrition to their diets. They had developed spice blending techniques that used locally available herbs and imported aromatics to create flavor profiles that were both delicious and medicinally beneficial. But perhaps most remarkably, they understood food safety principles that protected them from the foodborne illnesses that could devastate communities without modern medical care. They knew which combinations of ingredients provided natural preservation, which cooking techniques eliminated dangerous bacteria, and which storage methods prevented spoilage in hot, humid conditions. The evening meal itself was a carefully orchestrated social event that served functions far beyond simple nutrition. The way people were seated reflected social hierarchies, but also provided opportunities for mentoring relationships between older and younger community members. The order in which different dishes were served created natural conversation rhythms that allowed for the sharing of information, the resolution of conflicts, and the maintenance of social bonds that held communities together. Children weren't just passive recipients of food during these evening gatherings. They were active participants in elaborate educational processes that transmitted everything from practical skills to cultural values. While adults were eating and talking, children were learning about food preparation, social etiquette, economic relationships, and the complex web of obligations and opportunities that would shape their adult lives. The stories told during these evening meals weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated information management systems that preserved historical knowledge, technical expertise, and cultural wisdom in ways that made them memorable and personally meaningful. A story about a clever farmer who
Principles that listeners could apply in their own lives. Religious stories served similar educational functions, but they also provided emotional and psychological support that helped people cope with the challenges and uncertainties of daily life. Stories about gods overcoming obstacles, heroes persevering through difficulties, and communities surviving disasters provided both practical guidance and emotional reassurance that strengthened individual resilience and community solidarity.
Music during these evening gatherings reveals another layer of sophistication that most people never consider. Egyptian musicians weren't just playing random tunes to provide background entertainment. They were performing complex compositions that served multiple functions simultaneously, creating emotional atmospheres that enhanced social bonding while also transmitting cultural information and providing opportunities for individual expression. The instruments themselves were technological marvels that required sophisticated understanding of acoustics, material science, and manufacturing techniques. Harps had to be constructed with precise tension systems that maintained proper tuning despite extreme temperature variations. Drums required carefully prepared animal skins that produced specific tonal qualities while withstanding constant use. Flutes and other wind instruments demanded precise measurements and finishing techniques that created accurate pitch relationships and pleasing timbres. But beyond the technical aspects, Egyptian music served psychological and social functions that were essential for community well-being. Different types of music were used to create specific emotional states that served therapeutic purposes, helping people process grief, celebrate achievements, manage anxiety, and maintain the emotional balance necessary for effective functioning in challenging environments. The dancing that accompanied this music wasn't just physical entertainment. It was a complex communication system that allowed for the expression of ideas and emotions that were difficult to convey through words alone. Different dance forms served different social functions, from courtship rituals that helped young people form appropriate partnerships, to religious ceremonies that maintained spiritual connections, to competitive displays that established social hierarchies without resorting to violence. Children learned these dance forms through daily participation, gradually mastering not just the physical movements, but also the cultural meanings and social context that made dancing an effective tool for community building and personal expression. By adulthood, most Egyptians possessed a vocabulary of physical movement that allowed them to participate in complex social interactions that strengthened community bonds while providing outlets for individual creativity. Games played during these evening hours reveal another dimension of Egyptian sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient life. These weren't just simple diversions to pass time. They were educational tools that taught everything from mathematical concepts to strategic thinking, from social skills to ethical principles. Board games like Senate weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated simulations that helped players understand complex concepts about probability, planning, and decision-making under uncertainty. The religious symbolism embedded in these games provided opportunities for discussing spiritual concepts in ways that were both intellectually engaging and emotionally meaningful. Physical games and competitions served similar educational functions, while also providing the exercise and skill development that were essential for survival in a physically demanding environment. Wrestling matches, running competitions, and various ball games weren't just fun. They were training systems that maintained the physical fitness and competitive skills that individuals needed to succeed in their daily work and contribute effectively to community defense. But perhaps most importantly, these games provided opportunities for social interaction across age groups and social classes in ways that strengthened community cohesion while allowing for the peaceful resolution of tensions and conflicts that might otherwise disrupt social harmony. The evening hours also provided time for the maintenance and creation of the material objects that made Egyptian daily life possible. This wasn't just busy work to fill idle time. It was essential economic activity that required sophisticated skills and careful coordination between different community members. Women often spent evening hours engaged in textile production that was far more complex than simple weaving. They had to process raw materials like flax and wool using techniques that required deep understanding of fiber properties, chemical treatments, and mechanical processes. They operated looms that were engineering marvels, capable of producing fabrics with complex patterns, varying textures, and specific performance characteristics suited for different purposes. The designs they created weren't just decorative. They were information systems that communicated social status, regional identity, religious beliefs, and personal achievements in ways that were immediately recognizable to other community members. A skilled textile worker could look at someone's clothing and immediately understand their occupation, their family background, their economic status, and their role in the community's social structure. Men often used evening hours for tool maintenance and creation that was equally sophisticated and equally essential for community survival. They had to maintain metal tools using techniques that required understanding of metallurgy, heat treatment, and precision shaping that would impress modern craftsmen. They created wooden implements using carpentry skills that combined artistic sensibility with functional excellence and durability requirements. But beyond these obvious practical activities, evening hours provided time for the kind of innovation and experimentation that allowed Egyptian technology and culture to evolve and improve over time. Craftsmen used their leisure time to experiment with new techniques, test different materials, and develop improved tools and methods that enhanced productivity and quality in their daily work. These innovations weren't just individual achievements, they were community resources that were shared through informal networks that connected craftsmen across different specialties and different regions. A carpenter who developed an improved joint technique would share that knowledge with other woodworkers, who would adapt and refine it further, creating a continuous improvement process that strengthened the entire technological base of Egyptian civilization. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of personal relationships and individual development that were essential for psychological well-being and social stability. Courtship rituals weren't just romantic diversions, they were complex social processes that helped young people form partnerships that would contribute to community strength and individual happiness. These courtship processes involved elaborate systems of gift exchange, artistic performance, and social interaction that allowed potential partners to demonstrate their skills, values, and compatibility in ways that helped ensure successful long-term relationships. Parents and community elders played important roles in these processes, not as controlling authorities, but as advisors and facilitators who helped young people navigate the complex social and economic considerations that affected partnership decisions. Marriage arrangements weren't just personal choices, they were economic alliances that affected the prosperity and stability of extended families and entire communities. The evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of extended discussion and negotiation that allowed these arrangements to develop in ways that balanced individual desires with community needs. But even beyond courtship and marriage, the evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of personal growth and individual expression that were essential for human flourishing. People used this time for artistic pursuits, intellectual development, and spiritual practices that enrich their lives, while also contributing to the cultural wealth of their communities. The artistic activities weren't just hobbies, they were sophisticated creative practices that required years of training and constant refinement. Painters, sculptors, and other visual artists used evening hours to develop techniques, experiment with materials, and create works that served both aesthetic and functional purposes in their communities. Musicians and poets used this time to compose new works, refine their performance skills, and explore creative possibilities that push the boundaries of their artistic traditions while remaining connected to the cultural values that gave their work meaning and social relevance. But perhaps most importantly, the evening hours provided time for the kind of reflection and contemplation that allowed individuals to process their experiences, understand their place in the larger community, and develop the wisdom and perspective that made them effective contributors to the collective well-being. This personal development wasn't just individual self-improvement. It was community investment that strengthened the human resources available for addressing collective challenges and pursuing shared goals. Communities recognized that individual growth contributed to collective prosperity, and they structured their social systems to support and encourage personal development in ways that benefited everyone. The seasonal variations in evening activities,
Another layer of sophistication in Egyptian social organization. Different times of year brought different opportunities and challenges that required adaptive responses from individuals and communities. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, evening hours might be extended into elaborate festivals and celebrations that could last for days. These weren't just parties, they were community-building exercises that strengthened social bonds, resolved accumulated tensions, and provided opportunities for the kind of intensive cultural transmission that preserved traditional knowledge while allowing for innovation and adaptation. During planting and harvest seasons, when daytime work was intensive and urgent, evening activities might be more focused on rest and recovery. But they still included the essential social and cultural functions that maintained community cohesion and individual well-being. The ability to adapt these social patterns to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential functions demonstrates a level of cultural sophistication that allowed Egyptian civilization to persist through centuries of environmental, political, and economic changes that destroyed less adaptable societies. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Egyptian evening life was how it balanced individual needs with collective requirements in ways that created sustainable communities that could thrive over long periods of time. The social structures that emerged during these evening hours weren't imposed from above by authorities. They developed organically through the daily interactions of people who understood that their individual well-being depended on the health and prosperity of their communities. This understanding created social systems that were both flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and stable enough to provide the predictability and security that allowed individuals to plan for the future and invest in long-term relationships and projects. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of inter-community interaction that connected local Egyptian communities to the broader civilization and to external trade networks that brought goods, ideas, and people from across the known world. Traveling merchants, visiting craftsmen, religious pilgrims, and government officials often participated in these evening social activities, bringing news, ideas, and perspectives from other regions that enriched local communities while also connecting them to larger networks of information and opportunity. These interactions weren't just casual social exchanges. They were essential components of the communication systems that allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain coherence across vast distances and diverse environmental conditions. The information that flowed through these informal networks complemented the formal communication systems maintained by government and religious authorities, creating redundant information pathways that ensured that important knowledge reached all parts of Egyptian society. The cultural exchange that occurred during these evening interactions also contributed to the continuous evolution and refinement of Egyptian civilization, allowing local innovations to spread throughout the kingdom, while also bringing external ideas and techniques that enhanced Egyptian capabilities and opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, these evening social activities provided the foundation for the kind of community resilience that allowed Egyptian civilization to survive and prosper through periods of political instability, environmental challenges, and economic disruption that would have destroyed less socially cohesive societies. The social bonds formed during these daily evening gatherings created networks of mutual support and cooperation that could be activated during emergencies, providing the collective response capabilities that were essential for community survival in a challenging environment. The knowledge systems maintained through these evening educational activities preserved the technical expertise and cultural wisdom that allowed communities to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character and values.
The conflict resolution mechanisms that operated during these social gatherings prevented minor disputes and tensions from escalating into serious conflicts that could disrupt community functioning and threaten collective security. As we delve deeper into the complexity of ancient Egyptian evening life, we begin to understand that these weren't just people trying to survive in a harsh environment. They were sophisticated social beings who had created cultural systems that supported both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity in ways that modern societies are still trying to achieve. Their evening routines reveal people who understood that human well-being required more than just adequate food and shelter. It required meaningful social relationships, opportunities for personal growth, creative expression, and participation in something larger than individual survival. The sophistication of their social organization, the depth of their cultural knowledge, and the effectiveness of their community-building practices challenge our assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of achieving, and suggest that we might have something to learn from their approaches to organizing human communities. But the evening hours were just one part of a daily cycle that included sleep patterns and morning preparations that were equally sophisticated and equally essential for the functioning of Egyptian civilization. The way Egyptians managed the transition between waking and sleeping hours revealed another dimension of their understanding of human needs and their ability to create social systems that supported optimal human functioning. The preparation for sleep wasn't just a matter of lying down when exhaustion overcame them. It was a carefully managed process that recognized the importance of rest for physical health, mental well-being, and spiritual balance. Egyptian sleeping arrangements reflected both practical considerations about climate and security and sophisticated understanding of how physical environment affected sleep quality and overall health. Their beds weren't just places to collapse at the end of exhausting days. They were carefully designed systems that provided comfort, support, and protection in ways that maximized rest quality, while also reflecting social status and cultural values. The materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements of Egyptian beds revealed technological sophistication and artistic sensibility that challenge our assumptions about ancient manufacturing capabilities. But even more remarkably, Egyptian sleep practices included recognition of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of rest that modern sleep science is only beginning to understand. Their bedtime routines included practices designed to process the day's experiences, prepare the mind for restorative sleep, and maintain the spiritual connections that they believed were essential for individual and community well-being. The dreams that occurred during sleep weren't just random mental activity. They were considered important sources of information, guidance, and spiritual communication that required careful attention and interpretation. Egyptians developed sophisticated systems for understanding and responding to dream experiences that integrated psychological insight with spiritual belief in ways that provided practical guidance for daily life decisions. As morning approached and the cycle began again, Egyptians didn't just wake up randomly and stumble into another day. They engaged in carefully structured transition processes that prepared them physically, mentally, and spiritually for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. These morning routines weren't just personal habits. They were essential components of the social and economic systems that made Egyptian civilization possible. The morning planning activities that began each day included consideration of weather conditions, seasonal requirements, community obligations, family needs, and individual goals in ways that optimized both personal effectiveness and collective prosperity. These weren't simple to-do lists. They were strategic planning processes that took into account multiple variables and competing priorities in ways that would impress modern project managers. The coordination required to make this system work reveals organizational capabilities that challenge our assumptions about what ancient peoples could achieve without modern communication and information management technologies. Yet somehow, millions of Egyptians,
Egyptians managed to coordinate their daily activities in ways that created and maintained one of history's most successful and longest-lasting civilizations. As we continue to explore the details of ancient Egyptian daily life, we begin to understand that these weren't just people who happened to live a long time ago. They were sophisticated human beings who had developed solutions to fundamental challenges of human organization that remain relevant today. Their approaches to community building, resource management, education, conflict resolution, and individual development offer insights that could inform modern efforts to create sustainable, equitable, and fulfilling human societies. But to fully understand these insights, we need to continue our exploration of the details of Egyptian daily life, examining not just what they did, but how they did it, and why their approaches were so effective at creating human flourishing in challenging circumstances. The coordination challenges faced by ordinary Egyptians reveal problem-solving abilities that would humble most modern communities. Consider the daily reality of a small farming village during a harvest season, when timing meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. Every family had to coordinate their individual harvesting activities with their neighbors, because Egyptian agriculture wasn't just about individual plots of land, it was about managing complex irrigation systems that served multiple families, coordinating labor exchanges that allowed smaller families to handle large harvests, and timing everything to take advantage of optimal weather conditions that might last only a few days. The village headman's daily routine during harvest season required him to balance dozens of competing demands while maintaining the social harmony that made cooperation possible. His morning began before anyone else's, walking through the village and the surrounding fields to assess conditions, identify potential problems, and plan the day's activities based on factors that range from soil moisture levels to family disputes that might affect work productivity. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. He had to do all of this without any of the communication technologies we take for granted. No phones, no radios, no written schedules that could be distributed to everyone involved. Instead, he relied on a sophisticated system of visual signals, verbal messages, and social protocols that had been refined over generations to maximize efficiency while minimizing misunderstandings. The signal systems alone were masterpieces of practical communication design. Different colored flags or banners indicated different types of activities or priorities. Drum patterns conveyed specific messages about timing, location, or resource needs. Even the positioning of everyday objects like pottery jars or farming tools could communicate important information to people who understood the local conventions. Children played crucial roles in these communication networks, serving as messengers who carried information between different work groups, different families, and different areas of the village territory. But they weren't just running around randomly delivering messages. They were trained in complex protocols that ensured accurate information transmission, while also teaching them the organizational skills they would need as adults. A typical child messenger understood dozens of different message types, knew the priority levels that determined which messages took precedence, and could adapt their delivery methods based on the recipient's current activity and social status. This training wasn't just practical education, it was character development that taught children about responsibility, discretion, and the importance of accurate communication for community well-being. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed communication skills that made them effective participants in the complex social and economic networks that held Egyptian society together. The daily management of these communication networks revealed another layer of Egyptian organizational sophistication. Information flowed through multiple channels simultaneously, creating redundancy that prevented critical communications from being lost, while also allowing for verification and error correction that maintained accuracy and reliability. Formal channels carried official information from government authorities, religious leaders, and community officials.
Informal channels carried personal communications, local news, and the kind of social information that helped people maintain relationships and coordinate their private activities. But emergency channels could override normal communication patterns when urgent situations required immediate community response. But perhaps most impressively, Egyptians developed feedback systems that allowed them to monitor the effectiveness of their communication networks and make adjustments when problems were identified. Village leaders regularly checked to ensure that important information had reached all intended recipients, that instructions were being understood and followed correctly, and that the communication systems were adapting effectively to changing circumstances. This systematic approach to communication management extended to every aspect of Egyptian daily life, creating information networks that connected individual families to their local communities to regional centers, and regional centers to the national government and religious institutions that provided overall coordination for the entire civilization. The daily life of a regional message coordinator reveals just how sophisticated these systems had become. His responsibilities included managing multiple communication networks simultaneously, coordinating information between different types of organizations, and ensuring that critical information reached appropriate decision makers quickly enough to be useful for planning and problem solving. His morning routine included checking multiple information sources to identify developing situations that might require coordinated responses. He reviewed reports from local officials about everything from crop conditions to security concerns, from trade opportunities to resource shortages that might affect regional stability. But he also monitored informal information networks that carried rumors, gossip, and unofficial observations that sometimes provided early warning about problems that hadn't yet reached official attention. Distinguishing between reliable and unreliable informal information required sophisticated analytical skills and deep understanding of local social dynamics and information patterns. Once he had assessed the current information environment, he faced the complex challenge of determining which information needed to be transmitted to which recipients, in what format, and with what priority level. This wasn't just a matter of following predetermined procedures. It required strategic thinking about how different pieces of information might interact with each other and with ongoing activities in different parts of his region. The actual transmission process involved coordinating multiple messengers, multiple delivery methods, and multiple timing considerations that had to account for travel conditions, recipient availability, and the relative urgency of different communications. A single morning's work might involve sending urgent messages about flood conditions to agricultural communities, routine administrative reports to government officials, and personal communications that maintained the social relationships essential for effective regional coordination. But beyond these obvious duties, regional coordinators served as information analysts who identified patterns and trends that might not be visible to local officials focused on their immediate responsibilities. They looked for connections between seemingly unrelated events, early indicators of developing problems, and opportunities for coordinated action that could benefit multiple communities simultaneously. This analytical function was crucial for maintaining the stability and prosperity of Egyptian civilization because it allowed problems to be addressed before they became crises and opportunities to be exploited before they disappeared. The daily analytical work of these coordinators contributed to the strategic planning capabilities that allowed Egyptian leaders to manage a complex civilization effectively across centuries of changing conditions. The information processing techniques they used were remarkably sophisticated, involving systematic comparison of current conditions with historical patterns, identification of anomalies that might indicate developing problems, and projection of likely future developments based on current trends and known cause and effect relationships. They maintained detailed records that allowed them to track changes over time, identify seasonal patterns that affected planning and resource allocation, and document successful and unsuccessful responses to various types of challenges.
Administrative paperwork were strategic intelligence systems that informed decision-making at every level of Egyptian society. The daily record-keeping activities required not just clerical skills, but also analytical abilities that allowed coordinators to extract meaningful patterns from large amounts of detailed information. They had to identify which details were significant and which were routine, which patterns indicated important trends and which reflected normal variations, and which information required immediate action and which could be addressed through normal planning processes. But perhaps most remarkably, they had to do all of this analysis without computers, statistical software, or any of the information processing tools that modern analysts consider essential. Instead, they relied on mental models, systematic procedures, and collaborative analytical processes that distributed complex analytical tasks across multiple people with different expertise and perspectives. The collaborative aspects of Egyptian information analysis reveal another dimension of their organizational sophistication. Different analysts specialized in different types of information and different types of analysis, creating analytical networks that could handle far more complex problems than any individual analyst could manage alone. Economic analysts focused on trade patterns, resource availability, and production trends that affected regional prosperity and stability. Agricultural analysts monitored weather patterns, crop conditions, and farming practices that determined food security and rural economic conditions. Security analysts tracked political developments, population movements, and external threats that might require military or diplomatic responses. But these analysts didn't work in isolation. They participated in regular coordination meetings that allowed them to share information, compare analyses, and develop integrated assessments that informed strategic planning and policy decisions. These coordination processes weren't just information-sharing sessions. They were collaborative analytical exercises that produced insights and understanding that no individual analyst could achieve independently. The daily routine of participating in these analytical networks required communication skills that went far beyond simple information transmission. Analysts had to present complex information clearly and concisely, ask questions that elicited useful information from their colleagues, and participate in discussions that built shared understanding of complex situations and appropriate responses. They also had to maintain awareness of how their specialized analyses fit into broader strategic contexts, ensuring that their technical expertise contributed effectively to overall decision-making processes, rather than creating analytical silos that missed important connections and implications. This systems thinking approach to analysis and planning was one of the key factors that allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain coherence and effectiveness across vast distances and long periods of time. By ensuring that specialized knowledge was integrated into broader understanding, Egyptians avoided the fragmentation and coordination failures that destroyed many other ancient civilizations. The daily implementation of these systems thinking approaches required organizational disciplines that were embedded in routine activities throughout Egyptian society. People at every level understood that their individual responsibilities were part of larger systems that required coordination and mutual support to function effectively. Farmers understood that their individual agricultural decisions affected community food security and regional economic stability. Craftsmen understood that their quality standards and production schedules affected trade relationships and community reputation. Merchants understood that their business practices affected regional prosperity and intercommune relationships.
This systems awareness wasn't just abstract understanding. It was practical knowledge that shaped daily decision-making and behavior in ways that optimized both individual effectiveness and collective performance. People made daily choices that balanced their personal interests with community needs, not because they were forced to by external authorities, but because they understood that their long-term individual prosperity depended on the health and success of the larger systems of which they were part. The educational processes that created this systems awareness were embedded in daily life activities rather than separated into formal schooling that was disconnected from practical application. Children learned about systems thinking by participating in family and community activities that required coordination and mutual support, gradually developing the understanding and skills that would make them effective adult participants in Egyptian civilization. The daily educational activities weren't just skill training, they were character development processes that taught values, attitudes, and habits of thought that supported effective participation in complex social and economic systems. Children learned not just what to do, but why it mattered, and how their individual contributions fit into larger patterns of collective action. This character development wasn't just moral instruction, it was practical preparation for adult responsibilities that required sophisticated understanding of cause and effect relationships, long-term consequences of short-term decisions, and the interdependencies that connected individual actions to community outcomes. The daily reinforcement of these lessons through practical application ensured that learning was deeply internalized and readily available for application in new and changing circumstances. Children didn't just memorize abstract principles, they developed intuitive understanding that allowed them to adapt their knowledge to situations that weren't covered in their formal education. This adaptive learning capability was essential for success in Egyptian society because the challenges and opportunities that people faced were constantly changing as environmental conditions, economic circumstances, and political situations evolved over time. The ability to apply fundamental principles to new situations was more valuable than detailed knowledge of specific procedures that might become obsolete. The daily practice of adaptive problem-solving began early in childhood and continued throughout adult life, creating learning communities where knowledge was continuously refined and updated through practical experience and shared reflection on successes and failures. These learning communities weren't just educational institutions, they were innovation systems that generated continuous improvement in Egyptian capabilities and performance. Daily work activities included systematic attention to identifying better ways of doing things, testing new approaches, and sharing successful innovations with others who could benefit from them. The innovation processes weren't just individual creativity, they were collaborative efforts that combined different perspectives, expertise, and experience to develop solutions that were more effective than any individual could create alone. Daily work routines included time for experimentation, reflection, and discussion that supported continuous learning and improvement. But innovation wasn't just about technical improvements. It also included social innovations that improved coordination, cooperation, and conflict resolution within communities and between different groups. Egyptians continuously refined their social systems to better support individual well-being and collective effectiveness. The daily maintenance of these social systems required constant attention to relationship dynamics, communication patterns, and the informal processes that actually determined how well formal institutions functioned in practice. Community leaders spent significant time each day monitoring social conditions, identifying emerging tensions or problems, and facilitating the discussions and negotiations that prevented minor issues from escalating into serious conflicts. This social maintenance work wasn't just crisis management, it was proactive community development that strengthened social bonds, improved cooperation, and enhanced the collective capabilities that allowed communities to address challenges and pursue opportunities effectively. The daily social maintenance activities included everything from mediating disputes between individuals to facilitating discussions about community priorities and resource allocation. But they also included the less obvious work of maintaining the cultural traditions, shared values, and common understandings that provided the foundation for effective cooperation. This cultural maintenance work was essential because Egyptian society was constantly changing as new people joined communities, as economic conditions evolved, and as external influences introduced new ideas and practices. Maintaining cultural coherence while adapting to change required sophisticated understanding of what was essential to preserve and what could be modified without undermining community effectiveness. The daily cultural maintenance activities weren't just preserving the past, they were actively creating the future by determining how Egyptian traditions would evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. Community leaders facilitated discussions that helped people understand how traditional values and practices could be applied to new situations and how new opportunities could be pursued in ways that remained consistent with community values.
Practical problem-solving sessions that addressed specific challenges and opportunities that communities faced in their daily lives. The outcomes of these discussions shaped daily routines, resource allocation decisions, and social relationships in ways that determined community prosperity and individual well-being. The daily implementation of cultural adaptation decisions required coordination between different community groups, different generations, and different areas of specialization that might have different perspectives on appropriate responses to changing conditions. Older community members brought historical perspective and accumulated wisdom that helped evaluate proposed changes against past experience. Younger members brought energy, new ideas, and different perspectives that helped communities avoid becoming trapped in outdated approaches. People with different specializations brought technical expertise that helped evaluate the practical implications of different adaptation strategies. The daily coordination of these different perspectives required meeting processes, discussion formats, and decision-making procedures that maximize the benefits of diversity while maintaining the unity and focus necessary for effective collective action. These coordination processes weren't just democratic participation. They were sophisticated organizational systems that optimize group intelligence and decision-making effectiveness. The meeting processes alone were masterpieces of organizational design that balanced efficiency with inclusiveness, ensuring that important decisions received adequate consideration without becoming bogged down in endless discussion that prevented timely action. Different types of decisions required different types of meetings with different participation rules, different discussion formats, and different decision-making procedures. Routine operational decisions might be handled through quick consultations between directly affected parties, while strategic planning decisions might require extended community discussions that allowed for thorough exploration of alternatives and implications. Emergency decisions might bypass normal consultation processes while including provisions for later review and adjustment based on broader community input. The daily management of these different decision-making processes required leadership skills that went far beyond simple authority or charisma. Effective community leaders understood how to facilitate productive discussions, how to help groups reach decisions that balance competing interests and values, and how to implement decisions in ways that maintained community support and cooperation. These leadership skills weren't just innate talents, they were learned capabilities that were developed through years of practice and mentoring by experienced leaders.
The daily apprenticeship activities that prepared future leaders included not just observation of leadership techniques, but also hands-on practice with increasingly complex responsibilities that built the skills and confidence necessary for effective community leadership. The leadership development processes weren't just individual skill building. They were community investment activities that ensured continuity and quality in the leadership capabilities that were essential for long-term community success. Communities actively identified and developed leadership potential in their members, providing opportunities and support that helped talented individuals develop their capabilities, while also ensuring that leadership remained connected to community values and priorities. But leadership development wasn't just about preparing individuals for formal leadership positions. It was also about developing the distributed leadership capabilities that allowed communities to function effectively even when formal leaders were unavailable or when situations required rapid response that couldn't wait for centralized decision-making. The daily cultivation of distributed leadership capabilities created communities that were resilient, adaptable, and capable of addressing challenges and opportunities at multiple levels simultaneously. Every community member understood their role in collective decision-making and had the skills necessary to contribute effectively to community problem-solving and planning processes. This distributed leadership capability was one of the key factors that allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain stability and effectiveness through centuries of changing conditions and challenges that might have overwhelmed more centralized or hierarchical societies. The daily reality of distributed leadership in Egyptian communities reveals just how far ahead of their time these people really were in understanding human organization and motivation. Every morning, as families began their routines, they weren't just following orders from some distant authority figure. Instead, they were making dozens of individual decisions that required them to balance personal needs with community welfare in ways that would challenge modern organizational theorists. Take something as simple as water management in a typical village. The community well wasn't just a shared resource that people used randomly whenever they felt like it. Instead, families had developed sophisticated scheduling systems that ensured everyone had access to clean water, while also maintaining the well's long-term productivity and preventing conflicts that could tear the community apart. The daily water collection routines weren't imposed by some central authority issuing detailed regulations. Instead, they emerged from ongoing negotiations between families who understood that their individual water security depended on the collective management of this precious resource. Different families took responsibility for different aspects of well maintenance, from cleaning debris to repairing structural damage to monitoring water quality for signs of contamination. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. These responsibilities weren't assigned based on arbitrary authority relationships. Instead, they reflected each family's particular skills, resources, and circumstances in ways that maximize community benefit, while also ensuring that the burden of maintaining shared resources was distributed fairly among all users. The woman who understood stone construction techniques naturally took responsibility for maintaining the well's structural integrity. The family with the strongest young men handled the heavy lifting involved in major repairs. The household with the most flexible schedule took on daily monitoring responsibilities that required regular attention but didn't demand specialized expertise. This organic division of labor created systems that were both efficient and sustainable because they matched responsibilities with capabilities in ways that people could maintain over long periods without burning out or becoming resentful of unfair treatment. The daily implementation of these systems required constant communication and adjustment, but it was communication that people engaged in willingly because they understood its importance for their collective welfare. The water management example illustrates a pattern that appeared throughout Egyptian daily life. the integration of individual autonomy with collective responsibility in ways that supported both personal fulfillment and community prosperity. People weren't just following orders or pursuing purely selfish interests. Instead, they were participating in complex cooperative systems that required sophisticated understanding of how individual actions affected collective outcomes. This integration of individual and collective interests extended to every aspect of daily economic activity, creating market systems that were far more sophisticated than the simple barter economies that most people associate with ancient civilizations. Egyptian merchants didn't just exchange goods based on immediate supply and demand relationships. Instead, they participated in complex networks that connected local communities to regional, national, and international trade systems. The daily life of a merchant family reveals economic thinking that would impress modern business analysts. Their morning planning sessions didn't just consider what goods they had available for trade. Instead, they analyzed market conditions across multiple communities, evaluated seasonal trends that affected both supply and demand, and developed trading strategies that balanced immediate profit opportunities with long-term relationship building that would support sustained business success. But their economic analysis went far beyond simple profit maximization. They also considered how their trading decisions would affect their local community's economic health, their suppliers' ability to maintain production quality and reliability, and their customers' capacity to continue purchasing their goods over time. This wasn't just enlightened self-interest, it was sophisticated understanding of how economic systems actually function in practice. The record-keeping systems that supported these economic analyses were technological marvels that managed complex information without any of the computational tools we consider essential for business operations. Merchant families maintained detailed records of inventory levels, price fluctuations, customer preferences, supplier reliability, and seasonal patterns using papyrus documents, wooden tablets, and memory systems that could track hundreds of variables simultaneously. The daily maintenance of these record-keeping systems required mathematical skills that went far beyond simple arithmetic. Merchants had to calculate exchange rates between different types of goods, project future supply and demand based on current trends and historical patterns, and manage risk by diversifying their portfolio of goods and trading partners.
Diversifying their trading activities across different products, different markets, and different time horizons. But perhaps most impressively, they had to do all of this mathematical analysis in their heads or using simple calculating tools without the spreadsheets, databases, and analytical software that modern businesses depend on for far simpler calculations. The mental mathematical capabilities that Egyptian merchants developed through daily practice would astonish modern business people. The trading negotiations themselves reveal another dimension of Egyptian sophistication in managing complex human relationships for mutual benefit. These weren't simple haggling sessions where each party tried to extract maximum advantage from the other. Instead, they were collaborative problem-solving processes where traders worked together to find arrangements that provided adequate benefit for all parties, while also supporting the long-term relationships that made ongoing business possible. The negotiation processes required cultural sensitivity that went far beyond basic politeness. Merchants dealing with traders from different regions had to understand local customs, social hierarchies, religious practices, and economic traditions that affected how business relationships were established and maintained. A merchant who violated cultural norms in one community might find himself excluded from trading opportunities throughout an entire region. But cultural sensitivity wasn't just about avoiding offense. It was also about identifying opportunities for mutually beneficial arrangements that might not be obvious to outsiders who didn't understand local conditions and needs.
A merchant who understood that a particular community had seasonal labor shortages might arrange trades that provided workers during critical periods in exchange for goods that were abundant locally but scarce in his home community. These complex trading arrangements required legal and social frameworks that could enforce agreements across long distances and extended time periods. Egyptian merchants developed contract systems that specified not just the basic terms of exchanges, but also contingency provisions that addressed what would happen if various problems or opportunities arose during the execution of trading agreements. The daily management of these contractual relationships required legal knowledge that went far beyond simple rule following. Merchants had to understand how different legal traditions operated in different communities, how to structure agreements that would be enforceable across jurisdictional boundaries, and how to resolve disputes in ways that preserved business relationships while also protecting their legitimate interests. But the legal frameworks were just one component of broader social systems that supported complex economic relationships. Egyptian trading networks were held together by reputation systems that tracked the reliability, honesty, and competence of individual traders across multiple communities and extended time periods. The daily maintenance of trading reputations required consistent performance that met or exceeded expectations, honest communication about problems and limitations, and fair treatment of trading partners, even when circumstances might allow for taking advantage of others' difficulties or misunderstandings. A merchant's reputation was literally his most valuable asset because it determined his access to trading opportunities, credit arrangements, and the collaborative relationships that made complex business ventures possible. The reputation systems weren't just informal gossip networks. They were sophisticated information management systems that collected, verified, and transmitted reliable information about trader performance across vast networks of business relationships. Trading communities maintained detailed records of individual merchants' reliability, quality standards, and business practices that informed credit decisions, partnership opportunities, and the selection of trading partners for new ventures. These reputation systems created powerful incentives for honest and competent business practices because merchants who developed reputations for unreliability or dishonesty found themselves excluded from the most profitable trading opportunities. But they also provided support systems that helped merchants recover from mistakes or temporary difficulties because communities understood that everyone's long-term prosperity depended on maintaining strong trading networks. The daily operation of these reputation systems required constant information gathering and evaluation by traders, who had to assess the reliability of information they received about potential trading partners, monitor the performance of their current business relationships, and contribute accurate information about their own experiences that would help other traders make informed decisions. This information management work wasn't just business intelligence, it was community service that helped maintain the trust and cooperation that made complex trading networks possible. Merchants who provided accurate and timely information about market conditions, trading opportunities, and partner reliability were valued members of trading communities who gained access to better opportunities and more favorable terms in their own business activities. The collaborative aspects of Egyptian trading networks challenge modern assumptions about competition and cooperation in business relationships. While merchants certainly competed for customers and sought to maximize their own profits, they also understood that their individual success depended on the overall health and effectiveness of the trading systems in which they participated. This understanding led to business practices that balanced competitive advantage seeking with collaborative system building in ways that supported both individual success and collective prosperity. Merchants shared information that helped their competitors serve customers better, collaborated on infrastructure projects that benefited entire trading communities, and supported newcomers who might eventually become serious rivals. The daily implementation of these collaborative, competitive practices required sophisticated judgment about when competition was appropriate and when cooperation served everyone's interests better. Merchants had to identify opportunities where collaborative action could create benefits that exceeded what any individual could achieve alone, while also maintaining the competitive pressures that drove innovation and efficiency improvements. The infrastructure projects that trading communities undertook collaboratively reveal another dimension of Egyptian organizational sophistication. These weren't just simple construction projects. They were complex engineering and management challenges that required coordination between multiple communities, different areas of technical expertise, and competing priorities for limited resources. Consider the daily management challenges involved in building and maintaining the road networks that connected Egyptian communities to regional and international trading routes. These projects required surveying and engineering expertise to design routes that were both practical and durable. They needed construction expertise to build roads that could handle heavy traffic in challenging environmental conditions. They demanded organizational capabilities to coordinate work activities across multiple communities and extended time periods. But perhaps most challenging, they required political and diplomatic skills to negotiate agreements between different communities about cost sharing, maintenance responsibilities, and usage rights that would ensure long-term sustainability of these critical infrastructure systems. The daily diplomatic work involved in maintaining these agreements required constant attention to changing circumstances, evolving needs, and the inevitable conflicts that arose when different communities had different priorities and constraints. The engineering solutions that Egyptians developed for their infrastructure challenges revealed technological sophistication that rivals many modern approaches. Their road construction techniques created surfaces that remained usable for decades despite heavy traffic and extreme weather conditions. Their bridge designs handled seasonal flood variations while maintaining structural integrity under heavy loads. Their port facilities managed complex logistics requirements while protecting vessels and cargo from environmental hazards. But the technological achievements were just one aspect of infrastructure systems that also required sophisticated management and maintenance capabilities. The daily operation of Egyptian ports involved coordinating the activities of merchants, boatmen, stevedores, customs officials, and security personnel in ways that maximized efficiency while maintaining safety and preventing conflicts between different user groups. Port managers had to balance competing demands for limited dock space, coordinate loading and unloading activities to minimize delays, manage customs and tax collection processes that generated essential government revenue, and maintain security systems that protected valuable cargo and prevented smuggling or other illegal activities. The daily coordination challenges were enormous because ports handled traffic from multiple communities with different customs, different legal systems, and different business practices. Port managers served as cultural translators who helped different groups understand each other's requirements and find mutually acceptable arrangements for sharing port facilities and services. But ports weren't just components of transportation systems that included river navigation, overland routes, and the complex logistics requirements of moving goods across distances and challenging terrains.
Logistics networks that moved goods efficiently across vast distances. The daily management of these transportation systems required coordination between different types of transportation specialists, different communities along transportation routes, and different government authorities responsible for maintaining security and collecting taxes. River navigation alone presented daily challenges that required extraordinary skill and knowledge. Boat captains had to understand seasonal variations in water levels, current patterns, and navigation hazards that changed constantly based on weather conditions, flood patterns, and human activities along the riverbanks. They needed detailed knowledge of docking facilities, customs requirements, and local regulations in dozens of communities along their routes. The daily navigation decisions required real-time assessment of multiple risk factors, from weather conditions that might affect travel safety to political situations that might affect port access or customs procedures. Boat captains served as mobile intelligence gatherers who collected and transmitted information about conditions throughout their travel networks, contributing to the information systems that helped other travelers and traders make informed decisions about their own activities. The cargo management responsibilities were equally complex because different types of goods required different handling, storage, and transportation techniques. Fragile items needed protection from vibration and impact. Perishable goods required temperature and humidity control. Valuable items needed security measures that prevented theft while also allowing for necessary inspections and transfers. But cargo management wasn't just about protecting goods during transport. It was also about coordinating complex logistics that ensured goods arrived at their destinations at the right time to meet customer needs and market conditions. This required understanding of production schedules, seasonal demand patterns, and the lead times necessary for different types of transportation and handling processes. The daily logistics coordination work required communication systems that could track cargo movements, coordinate transfers between different transportation modes, and provide advance notice to customers and trading partners about expected arrival times and any delays or problems that might affect delivery schedules. These communication challenges were particularly complex because they had to function across multiple communities with different languages, different communication systems, and different technical capabilities for receiving and transmitting messages. Transportation managers served as nodes in communication networks that connected producers, traders, and customers across vast distances and diverse cultural contexts. The cultural bridging work that transportation systems provided was just as important as their economic functions because they facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that enriched Egyptian civilization and connected it to broader networks of human knowledge and innovation. Travelers weren't just moving goods, they were also carrying information, techniques, and perspectives that contributed to continuous learning and adaptation throughout Egyptian society. The daily cultural exchange activities that occurred at transportation hubs created learning environments where people from different communities could observe different approaches to common challenges, share their own innovations and discoveries, and collaborate on solving problems that affected multiple communities. These informal learning networks were essential components of the innovation systems that kept Egyptian civilization adaptable and progressive. But cultural exchange wasn't just accidental byproduct of economic activity. It was deliberately cultivated through social institutions that encouraged interaction, learning, and collaboration between people from different backgrounds and communities. Egyptian communities developed hospitality traditions, cultural events, and meeting formats that maximized opportunities for productive cultural exchange, while also maintaining social harmony and preventing conflicts between different groups. The daily management of these cultural institutions required social skills that went far beyond simple politeness or conflict avoidance. Community leaders had to understand how to facilitate productive interactions between people with different customs, values, and communication styles. They needed techniques for helping people find common ground while also respecting and celebrating differences that enriched community life. The festival systems that brought together people from multiple communities reveal another dimension of Egyptian sophistication in managing complex social and cultural dynamics. These weren't just parties or religious observances. They were carefully orchestrated events that served multiple functions simultaneously, from economic coordination to conflict resolution to cultural transmission and innovation. The daily preparation activities for major festivals required months of advance planning that coordinated the efforts of multiple communities, different areas of specialization, and competing demands for limited resources. Festival organizers had to manage everything from food production and transportation to entertainment programming and security arrangements, all while ensuring that the events served their intended cultural and social functions.
But festival organization wasn't just logistical management. It was also cultural curation that determined which traditions would be preserved and celebrated, which innovations would be introduced and tested, and which values and practices would be reinforced or modified through community participation in shared cultural experiences. The daily cultural curation work required deep understanding of community values and aspirations, sensitivity to changing social conditions and needs, and creativity in developing cultural expressions that remained connected to traditional foundations while also addressing contemporary challenges and opportunities. Festival programming had to balance entertainment with education, tradition with innovation, and local identity with broader cultural connections. Successful festivals created experiences that people enjoyed and remembered, while also transmitting important cultural knowledge and strengthening social bonds that supported community cooperation and resilience. The educational functions of festivals reveal another aspect of Egyptian sophistication in managing knowledge transmission and cultural continuity. These weren't just opportunities for people to have fun. They were also intensive learning experiences that transmitted practical skills, cultural values, and social knowledge in ways that were both effective and enjoyable. Children learned about their cultural heritage through stories, songs, and dramatic performances that made abstract concepts concrete and memorable. They observed adult skills and responsibilities through festival activities that demonstrated proper techniques and social behaviors. They practiced their own developing capabilities through games, competitions, and performance opportunities that provided feedback and encouragement. But adult education was equally important because festivals provided opportunities for sharing innovations, discussing community challenges, and learning about developments in other communities that might be relevant to local needs and opportunities. Festival discussions and demonstrations served as continuing education systems that kept community members current with evolving best practices and emerging possibilities. The knowledge management systems that supported these educational functions were remarkably sophisticated, involving systematic collection, organization, and presentation of information that maximized learning effectiveness while also ensuring accuracy and relevance. Festival educators weren't just entertainers, they were also researchers and analysts who studied community needs, gathered relevant information, and developed presentation methods that communicated effectively with diverse audiences. The daily research and preparation work required for effective festival education involved extensive consultation with community experts, systematic observation of successful practices in other communities, and creative development of teaching methods that engage participants while also transmitting essential knowledge and skills. But perhaps most remarkably, Egyptian festival systems created feedback mechanisms that allowed for continuous improvement and adaptation based on participant response and changing community needs. Festival organizers systematically evaluated the effectiveness of their educational programming, gathered suggestions for improvement, and modified their approaches to better serve their community's learning and development needs. These continuous improvement processes weren't just individual initiative, they were systematic community commitments to maintaining and enhancing the cultural institutions that supported collective learning and adaptation. Communities invested significant resources in developing and maintaining their festival systems because they understood their importance for long-term community success and individual fulfillment. The daily maintenance work required for these cultural institutions reveal another dimension of Egyptian understanding of what was necessary for creating and sustaining successful human communities. They recognized that cultural systems required the same careful attention and systematic maintenance as economic systems, political systems, and physical infrastructure. Cultural maintenance
Work included everything from preserving traditional knowledge and practices to adapting cultural institutions to changing circumstances and needs. Community leaders spent significant time each day monitoring the health and effectiveness of cultural systems, identifying emerging challenges or opportunities, and coordinating responses that maintained cultural vitality while also supporting community adaptation and growth.
This cultural maintenance work wasn't just preserving the past, it was actively creating the future by determining how Egyptian traditions and values would evolve to address new challenges and opportunities while maintaining their essential character and effectiveness. As we continue to explore the incredible complexity and sophistication of ancient Egyptian daily life, we begin to understand that these weren't just people who happened to live a long time ago. They were sophisticated human beings who had developed solutions to fundamental challenges of human organization, cooperation, and cultural development that remain relevant and impressive even by modern standards. Their daily routines reveal people who understood that creating successful communities required constant attention to multiple interconnected systems that had to be maintained, adapted, and improved on an ongoing basis. They developed organizational capabilities, cultural institutions, and social practices that supported both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity in ways that modern societies are still trying to achieve. But to fully appreciate their achievements, we need to continue our exploration of how these remarkable people managed the countless details and challenges that filled their daily lives, creating and maintaining one of history's most successful and enduring civilizations through sophisticated understanding of what humans need to thrive, individually and collectively. The religious dimensions of daily Egyptian life reveal layers of spiritual sophistication that would challenge anyone who thinks ancient peoples had simple, superstitious beliefs. Every morning, as families began their routines, they weren't just going through mechanical motions to survive another day. Instead, they were participating in a complex spiritual ecosystem that integrated religious observance with practical activities in ways that provided both psychological support and community cohesion. Consider the morning offerings that began each day in Egyptian households. These weren't just quick prayers mumbled before rushing off to work. Instead, they were carefully structured rituals that required specific preparations, proper timing, and genuine spiritual engagement that connected individuals to cosmic forces. They believed governed everything from personal health to agricultural success. The preparation of morning offerings required knowledge that went far beyond simple memorization of religious formulas. Family members had to understand which offerings were appropriate for different occasions, which deities should be honored for different types of requests or gratitude, and how to perform rituals in ways that demonstrated proper respect and achieved desired spiritual outcomes. But here's what makes Egyptian religious practice truly remarkable. It wasn't separated from daily practical activities. Instead, religious observances were integrated into work routines, family responsibilities, and community interactions in ways that made spiritual practice a constant element of daily life, rather than something confined to special occasions or designated sacred spaces. A farmer beginning his day in the fields didn't just grab his tools and start working. Instead, he began with offerings and prayers that asked for divine protection from accidents, favorable weather conditions, and successful crop growth. But these prayers weren't just wishful thinking. They were accompanied by practical preparations that demonstrated his commitment to doing his part to achieve the outcomes he was requesting from the gods. The tools themselves were often blessed or consecrated through rituals that connected their practical functions to spiritual purposes. A hoe wasn't just a piece of metal for breaking ground. It was a sacred implement that participated in the divine process of bringing forth life from the earth. This spiritual understanding of tools and work processes created attitudes toward daily labor that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. Work wasn't just something you did to earn money or survive. It was a form of worship that connected human activities to cosmic purposes and divine will. This understanding created work ethics and quality standards that went far beyond what economic incentives alone could motivate, because people believed their daily labor contributed to maintaining the harmony and order that kept the universe functioning properly. The daily religious observances that accompanied work activities weren't time-consuming ceremonies that interfered with productivity. Instead, they were brief but meaningful acknowledgments that integrated spiritual awareness into practical activities without disrupting the efficiency and focus necessary for effective work performance.
A craftsman shaping wood might pause periodically to acknowledge the spirit of the tree that provided his material, ask for guidance in achieving proper proportions in finish quality, or express gratitude for the skills and opportunities that made his work possible. These spiritual pauses actually enhanced rather than hindered work quality because they encouraged the kind of mindful attention and emotional engagement that produced superior results. The workshop environments themselves were designed to support both practical efficiency and spiritual practice. Many workshops included small shrines or sacred spaces where workers could make offerings, seek guidance, or express gratitude without leaving their work areas. These weren't elaborate temples, they were simple but meaningful spaces that acknowledged the spiritual dimensions of daily work activities. The spiritual practices associated with different types of work reveal sophisticated understanding of how religious observance could support both individual well-being and collective effectiveness. Different crafts had different patron deities, different ritual requirements, and different spiritual practices that reflected the specific challenges and opportunities associated with different types of work. Metal workers, for example, worked with materials and processes that involved dramatic transformations that seemed almost magical to ancient peoples. The process of heating metal until it glowed, shaping it while hot, and cooling it to create tools or decorative objects required spiritual practices that acknowledged the mysterious forces involved in these transformations, while also asking for protection from the very real dangers of working with fire and molten metal. The daily spiritual practices of metalworkers included offerings to Par, the god of craftsmanship, but also to other deities associated with fire, transformation, and protection from harm. These practices weren't just insurance policies against accidents, they were also psychological preparation techniques that helped workers maintain the focus and confidence necessary for safe and effective work with dangerous materials and processes. Textile workers faced different spiritual challenges that required different types of religious support. Their work involved transforming raw plant or animal fibers into useful and beautiful fabrics through processes that required patience, skill, and attention to detail over extended periods. The spiritual practices associated with textile work emphasized persistence, creativity, and the kind of meditative focus that could sustain high-quality work through long, repetitive processes. The daily religious observances of textile workers included prayers for steady hands, clear vision, and the creative inspiration necessary for developing beautiful and functional fabric designs. But they also included gratitude practices that acknowledged the plants and animals that provided their raw materials and requests for blessings on the people who would eventually use the fabrics they were creating. This awareness of the broader purposes and connections of their work created meaning and satisfaction that went far beyond simple economic compensation. Textile workers understood that their daily labor contributed to clothing families, decorating homes, and creating the material culture that supported community life and individual dignity. The spiritual practices associated with food preparation and storage reveal another dimension of Egyptian religious sophistication. Food wasn't just fuel for physical bodies, it was also spiritual nourishment that connected people to the divine forces that governed fertility, growth, and abundance. The daily activities involved in growing, preparing, and sharing food were opportunities for spiritual practice that acknowledged these divine connections while also expressing gratitude for the sustenance that made life possible. Women who specialized in food preparation often began their daily work with prayers and offerings that asked for guidance in creating nourishing and delicious meals, protection from foodborne illnesses, and blessings on the families and communities who would share the food they prepared. These prayers weren't just routine formalities, they were genuine expressions of spiritual understanding about the sacred nature of feeding others. The cooking processes themselves incorporated spiritual practices that enhanced both food quality and spiritual significance. Certain ingredients were added with specific prayers or intentions. Cooking fires were lit with acknowledgement of the sacred nature of the transformative power of heat. Food storage involved rituals that asked for divine protection from accidents, favorable weather conditions, and successful crop growth.
But these prayers weren't just wishful thinking. They were accompanied by practical preparations that demonstrated his commitment to doing his part to achieve the outcomes he was requesting from the gods. The tools themselves were often blessed or consecrated through rituals that connected their practical functions to spiritual purposes. A hoe wasn't just a piece of metal for breaking ground. It was a sacred implement that participated in the divine process of bringing forth life from the earth. This spiritual understanding of tools and work processes created attitudes toward daily labor that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. Work wasn't just something you did to earn money or survive. It was a form of worship that connected human activities to cosmic purposes and divine will. This understanding created work ethics and quality standards that went far beyond what economic incentives alone could motivate, because people believed their daily labor contributed to maintaining the harmony and order that kept the universe functioning properly. The daily religious observances that accompanied work activities weren't time-consuming ceremonies that interfered with productivity. Instead, they were brief but meaningful acknowledgments that integrated spiritual awareness into practical activities without disrupting the efficiency and focus necessary for effective work performance. A craftsman shaping wood might pause periodically to acknowledge the spirit of the tree that provided his material, ask for guidance in achieving proper proportions and finish quality, or express gratitude for the skills and opportunities that made his work possible. These spiritual pauses actually enhanced rather than hindered work quality, because they encouraged the kind of mindful attention and emotional engagement that produced superior results. The workshop environments themselves were designed to support both practical efficiency and spiritual practice. Many workshops included small shrines or sacred spaces where workers could make offerings, seek guidance, or express gratitude without leaving their work areas. These weren't elaborate temples. They were simple but meaningful spaces that acknowledged the spiritual dimensions of daily work activities. The spiritual practices that accompany different types of work reveal sophisticated understanding of how religious observance could support both individual well-being and collective effectiveness. Different crafts had different patron deities, different ritual requirements, and different spiritual practices that reflected the specific challenges and opportunities associated with different types of work. Metal workers, for example, worked with materials and processes that involved dramatic transformations that seemed almost magical to ancient peoples. The process of heating metal until it glowed, shaping it while hot, and cooling it to create tools or decorative objects required spiritual practices that acknowledged the mysterious forces involved in these transformations, while also asking for protection from the very real dangers of working with fire and molten metal. The daily spiritual practices of metalworkers included offerings to Ptah, the god of craftsmanship, but also to other deities associated with fire, transformation, and protection from harm. These practices weren't just insurance policies against accidents. They were also psychological preparation techniques that helped workers maintain the focus and confidence necessary for safe and effective work with dangerous materials and processes. Textile workers faced different spiritual challenges that required different types of religious support. Their work involved transforming raw plant or animal fibers into useful and beautiful fabrics through processes that required patience, skill, and attention to detail over extended periods. The spiritual practices associated with textile work emphasized persistence, creativity, and the kind of meditative focus that could sustain high-quality work through long, repetitive processes. The daily religious observances of textile workers included prayers for steady hands, clear vision, and the creative inspiration necessary for developing beautiful and functional fabric designs.
But they also included gratitude practices that acknowledged the plants and animals that provided their raw materials and requests for blessings on the people who would eventually use the fabrics they were creating. This awareness of the broader purposes and connections of their work created meaning and satisfaction that went far beyond simple economic compensation. Textile workers understood that their daily labor contributed to clothing families, decorating homes, and creating the material culture that supported community life and individual dignity. The spiritual practices associated with food preparation and storage reveal another dimension of Egyptian religious sophistication. Food wasn't just fuel for physical bodies, it was also spiritual nourishment that connected people to the divine forces that governed fertility, growth, and abundance. The daily activities involved in growing, preparing, and sharing food were opportunities for spiritual practice that acknowledged these divine connections while also expressing gratitude for the sustenance that made life possible. Women who specialized in food preparation often began their daily work with prayers and offerings that asked for guidance in creating nourishing and delicious meals, protection from food-borne illnesses, and blessings on the families and communities who would share the food they prepared. These prayers weren't just routine formalities, they were genuine expressions of spiritual understanding about the sacred nature of feeding others. The cooking processes themselves incorporated spiritual practices that enhanced both food quality and spiritual significance. Certain ingredients were added with specific prayers or intentions. Cooking fires were lit with acknowledgement of the sacred nature of the transformative power of heat. Food storage involved rituals that asked for spiritual practice that created and strengthened community bonds, while also honoring the divine generosity that made abundance possible. Family meals weren't just occasions for consuming nutrition, they were spiritual celebrations that acknowledged the many sources of blessing that made shared abundance possible. The daily religious practices associated with child rearing reveal Egyptian understanding of the spiritual dimensions of family life and community development. Children weren't just economic assets or sources of emotional satisfaction, they were also spiritual beings whose proper development required religious guidance and divine protection that complemented parental care and community support. The daily spiritual practices of parents included prayers for their children's health, safety, and proper development, but also for wisdom in providing appropriate guidance and discipline. Parenting was understood as a spiritual responsibility that required divine support and guidance because raising children properly affected not just individual families, but also the future well-being of entire communities. Children themselves participated in daily religious practices that were appropriate for their developmental stages and gradually prepared them for the adult spiritual responsibilities they would eventually assume. These weren't just formal religious education sessions, they were integrated learning experiences that taught spiritual concepts through participation in family and community religious activities. Young children learned prayers and simple rituals by observing and gradually participating in family religious practices. As they grew older, they took on more complex responsibilities that required greater understanding of religious principles and more sophisticated spiritual practices. By adulthood, they possessed the religious knowledge and spiritual disciplines necessary for maintaining their own spiritual practices, while also contributing to community religious life. The educational aspects of Egyptian religious practice reveals sophisticated understanding of how spiritual development could support both individual fulfillment and community effectiveness. Religious education wasn't just memorization of prayers and rituals, it was character development that taught values, attitudes, and behavioral patterns that supported both personal well-being and social cooperation. Daily religious practices taught patience through rituals that required careful preparation and sustained attention. They taught gratitude through acknowledgement of the many sources of blessing that made daily life possible. They taught humility through recognition of human dependence on divine support and guidance. They taught responsibility through understanding of how individual actions affected both personal spiritual development and community well-being. But perhaps most importantly, daily religious practices taught systems thinking that helped people understand how their individual activities connected to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. Religious observances weren't just personal spiritual exercises. They were also educational experiences that taught cosmic order, social responsibility, and the interconnections that linked
Responsibilities that reflected changing environmental conditions, agricultural activities, and community needs. During flood season, when the Nile inundated the farmlands and outdoor work was limited, religious practices emphasized reflection, planning, and preparation for the intensive activities that would follow when the waters receded. This was a time for spiritual renewal that prepared individuals and communities for the challenges and opportunities of the coming agricultural cycle. The daily religious practices during flood season included extended meditation periods, intensive study of religious texts and traditions, and community discussions about spiritual and practical preparations for the year ahead. These weren't just ways to pass time during forced inactivity. They were essential spiritual work that built the individual and collective resources necessary for success in the demanding periods that followed. Planting season brought different spiritual emphasis that reflected the hope, anxiety, and intensive activity associated with beginning new agricultural cycles. Daily religious practices during this period focused on requests for favorable weather, protection from pests and diseases, and divine blessing on the seeds and plantings that would determine the year's food security. The spiritual practices associated with planting weren't just requests for divine intervention, they were also psychological preparation techniques that helped farmers maintain the confidence and persistence necessary for effective work despite the uncertainties and challenges they faced. Planting required faith that seeds placed in the ground would eventually produce abundant harvests, and religious practices provided the spiritual support necessary for maintaining this faith through periods of doubt and difficulty. Harvest season brought spiritual practices that emphasized gratitude for successful crops, requests for continued protection during the vulnerable period when stored food could be damaged or destroyed, and preparation for the community celebrations that marked the completion of another successful agricultural cycle. The daily spiritual practices during harvest season included thanksgiving offerings that acknowledged divine generosity, prayers for wisdom in managing and distributing the harvest fairly, and requests for continued blessing on the community relationships that made successful agriculture possible. These practices weren't just expressions of individual gratitude, they were also community-building activities that reinforced the social bonds and shared values that supported collective prosperity. The religious festivals that punctuated the Egyptian calendar reveal the most elaborate and sophisticated aspects of their spiritual practices. These weren't just enlarged versions of daily religious observances. They were complex community events that served multiple spiritual, social, and practical functions simultaneously. The daily preparation activities for major religious festivals required months of advance planning that coordinated religious requirements with practical logistics in ways that ensured both spiritual authenticity and community participation. Festival organizers had to understand religious traditions and requirements while also managing the complex practical arrangements necessary for large community gatherings. The spiritual preparation for festivals involved not just individual prayer and meditation, but also community discussions about the meanings and purposes of the celebrations, resolution of conflicts that might interfere with proper festival observance, and collective commitment to the spiritual disciplines and community cooperation necessary for successful celebrations. Festival activities themselves integrated religious ceremonies with community feasting, artistic performances, and social activities that strengthened community bonds, while also providing intense spiritual experiences that renewed individual and collective commitment to shared values and purposes. The artistic elements of religious festivals reveal another dimension of Egyptian spiritual sophistication. Music, dance, visual arts, and dramatic performances weren't just entertainment additions to religious ceremonies. They were integral components of spiritual practices that engaged multiple senses and emotional capacities in ways that created profound religious experiences. The daily preparation of festival artistic elements required collaboration between religious authorities who understood religious requirements and artists who possessed the technical skills necessary for creating effective performances. This collaboration produced artistic expressions that were both spiritually authentic and artistically excellent, creating religious experiences that were both meaningful and memorable. The musical compositions created for religious festivals weren't just pleasant sounds that provided background for ceremonies. They were sophisticated artistic works that use rhythm, melody, and harmony to create specific emotional and spiritual states that enhanced religious participation and understanding. The daily practice sessions required for festival musical performances created learning communities where musicians developed both technical skills and spiritual understanding that allowed them to contribute effectively to community religious life. These practice sessions weren't just rehearsals for public performances. They were also spiritual disciplines that deepened participants' understanding of religious traditions and their personal commitment to community spiritual life. The dance traditions associated with religious festivals reveal similar integration of artistic excellence with spiritual authenticity. Egyptian religious dances weren't just physical movements that accompanied musical performances. They were embodied prayers that used physical expression to communicate spiritual concepts and create religious experiences that engage both performers and observers. The daily training required for religious dance performances involved not just physical conditioning and movement instruction, but also spiritual education that taught dancers about the religious meanings and purposes of their performances. Dancers had to understand the spiritual concepts they were expressing through movement and maintain the spiritual attitudes and intentions that made their performances authentic religious expressions rather than mere entertainment. The visual arts associated with religious festivals reveal another aspect of Egyptian spiritual sophistication. Paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, and architectural elements weren't just beautiful additions to religious spaces. They were spiritual technologies that used visual imagery to communicate religious concepts, create sacred atmospheres, and support spiritual practices. The daily work of creating religious art required artists who combined technical excellence with spiritual understanding in ways that produced works that were both artistically impressive and spiritually effective. Religious artists weren't just skilled craftsmen, they were also spiritual practitioners whose artistic work itself was a form of religious practice that contributed to community spiritual life. The creation process for religious artworks involved spiritual practices that blessed the materials, consecrated the tools, and maintained spiritual awareness throughout the production process. Artists understood that their work would be used for religious purposes and took responsibility for ensuring that their creations supported, rather than hindered, authentic spiritual experience.
But perhaps most remarkably, Egyptian religious art wasn't just created by specialists for passive consumption by community members. Instead, community members often participated in creating religious artworks, learning artistic skills while also deepening their spiritual understanding and commitment. The daily community art-making activities associated with religious festivals created learning environments where people of all skill levels could contribute to community spiritual life while also developing their own artistic capabilities and spiritual understanding. These activities weren't just craft projects, they were spiritual practices that strengthened both individual development and community bonds. The religious education systems that supported these complex spiritual practices reveal Egyptian understanding of how spiritual knowledge and practices could be transmitted effectively across generations and social groups. Religious education wasn't just formal instruction provided by specialized religious authorities. It was integrated learning that occurred through participation in daily religious practices and community spiritual activities. Children learned religious concepts and practices through observation and gradual participation in family and community spiritual activities. They didn't just memorize prayers and rituals, they developed understanding of spiritual principles through practical application in daily life situations that made abstract concepts concrete and personally meaningful. Adult religious education continued throughout life through ongoing participation in community spiritual activities, personal study and reflection, and mentoring relationships with more experienced spiritual practitioners. Religious learning wasn't just preparation for adult responsibilities, it was lifelong development that deepened understanding and
particular interests and needs. The spiritual counseling and guidance systems that supported individual religious development reveal another dimension of Egyptian religious sophistication. Community religious leaders weren't just ceremonial figures who performed public rituals. They were also spiritual advisors who provided personal guidance and support for community members facing spiritual challenges or seeking deeper understanding. The daily spiritual counseling activities included individual consultations about personal spiritual questions, guidance for people facing difficult life decisions, and support for individuals experiencing spiritual crises or challenges. These counseling services weren't just emotional support, they were also educational opportunities that helped people develop better understanding of spiritual principles and more effective spiritual practices. The spiritual guidance provided wasn't just abstract advice. It included practical instruction in spiritual disciplines, personalized recommendations for spiritual practices that addressed individual needs and circumstances, and ongoing support for people working to develop stronger spiritual lives. But perhaps most importantly, Egyptian spiritual counseling emphasized empowerment rather than dependence, teaching people to develop their own spiritual understanding and practices, rather than relying entirely on external religious authorities for spiritual guidance and support. The integration of Egyptian religious practices with daily practical activities created spiritual lives that were both deeply meaningful and thoroughly practical. Religious observance wasn't something that interfered with daily responsibilities. It was something that enhanced and supported effective performance of daily activities, while also providing the spiritual nourishment and community connection that made daily life fulfilling and meaningful. This integration of spiritual and practical life created individuals who were both spiritually developed and practically competent, communities that were both religiously observant and economically productive, and a civilization that was both spiritually sophisticated and materially successful. The daily reality of Egyptian spiritual life reveals people who understood that human beings need more than just material security and physical comfort to thrive. They developed religious practices and spiritual communities that provided meaning, purpose, and transcendent connection, while also supporting the practical activities and social relationships that made successful daily life possible. Their approach to integrating spiritual and practical life offers insights that remain relevant for modern people, seeking to create lives that are both materially successful and spiritually fulfilling, both individually satisfying and socially beneficial. As we continue to explore the remarkable sophistication of ancient Egyptian daily life, we see that their spiritual practices weren't just add-ons to practical activities. They were integral components of comprehensive life systems that supported human flourishing at multiple levels simultaneously. The healthcare systems that supported Egyptian daily life reveal another dimension of their sophisticated understanding of human needs and effective community organization. Egyptian approaches to health and healing integrated physical treatments with spiritual practices and social support in ways that address the multiple factors that affected individual and community well-being. Daily healthcare activities weren't just responses to illness and injury. They were proactive practices that maintained health and prevented problems through understanding of how diet, exercise, environment, and lifestyle affected physical and mental well-being. Egyptian families didn't just wait for health problems to develop. They engaged in daily practices that supported optimal health and identified potential problems before they became serious. The morning health routines that began each day included physical exercises that maintained strength and flexibility, dietary practices that provided balanced nutrition, and environmental modifications that protected against health hazards. But they also included spiritual practices that supported mental and emotional well-being, and social activities that provided the community support that was essential for comprehensive health maintenance. Egyptian understanding of the connections between physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health was remarkably sophisticated, reflecting holistic approaches to human well-being that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. They understood that effective healthcare required attention to all dimensions of human experience, rather than just treating isolated symptoms or conditions. The daily healthcare practices of Egyptian families included herbal preparations that provided both nutritional support and medical treatment, physical therapies that addressed musculoskeletal problems and maintained optimal function, and psychological supports that helped people cope with stress and maintain emotional balance. Women often specialized in healthcare knowledge and practices, maintaining herb gardens that provided medicinal plants, preparing therapeutic preparations that addressed common health problems, and providing healthcare services that supported family and community health. Their daily healthcare activities weren't just treating illness, they were maintaining comprehensive health systems that supported optimal well-being for everyone in their communities. The healthcare knowledge that women maintained and transmitted wasn't just folk wisdom passed down through generations. It was sophisticated understanding of human physiology, plant pharmacology, and therapeutic techniques that had been refined through centuries of careful observation and systematic experimentation. The daily healthcare activities included monitoring family and community members for early signs of health problems, preparing and administering therapeutic treatments, and providing the supportive care that helped people recover from illness and injury while maintaining their social connections and community roles. But Egyptian healthcare wasn't just individual family responsibility. It was also community activity that involved shared knowledge, collaborative treatment approaches, and collective support for people experiencing serious health challenges. Communities maintained healthcare resources and expertise that supplemented family capabilities, while also ensuring that everyone had access to the care they needed, regardless of their individual circumstances or capabilities. The daily community healthcare activities included sharing medicinal plants and therapeutic knowledge, providing collaborative care for people with serious health problems, and maintaining community health practices that prevented the spread of infectious diseases and addressed environmental health hazards. The healthcare practitioners who served Egyptian communities weren't just individual healers working in isolation. They were members of professional networks that shared knowledge, collaborated on difficult cases, and maintained standards of practice that ensured effective and safe healthcare delivery. The daily professional activities of healthcare practitioners included not just treating individual patients, but also maintaining and developing their knowledge and skills, collaborating with other practitioners to share expertise and resources, and contributing to community health education and prevention programs. The healthcare education systems that prepared new practitioners reveal Egyptian understanding of the complex knowledge and skills required for effective healthcare delivery. Healthcare education wasn't just apprenticeship in practical techniques. It was comprehensive education that included understanding of human anatomy and physiology, knowledge of therapeutic plants and preparations, and development of the diagnostic and treatment skills necessary for effective practice. The daily healthcare education activities included both formal instruction and practical experience that gradually prepared students for independent practice, while also ensuring that they understood the ethical responsibilities and community obligations that came with healthcare expertise. But healthcare education didn't end with initial training. It continued throughout practitioners' careers through ongoing learning opportunities, collaborative case discussions, and systematic observation of treatment outcomes that supported continuous improvement in healthcare knowledge and practices. The healthcare practitioners' professional activities included not just treating individual patients, but also studying new therapeutic approaches, experimenting with improved treatment methods, and sharing their discoveries and innovations with other practitioners who could benefit from their experience and insights. The healthcare systems that supported Egyptian communities weren't just individual services, they were integrated networks that connected family healthcare practices with community resources and professional expertise in ways that provided comprehensive health support for everyone, regardless of their individual circumstances or capabilities. The daily operation of these healthcare networks required coordination between different types of healthcare providers, different communities with varying needs and resources, and different levels of healthcare expertise that ranged from basic family care to specialized professional treatment. The daily healthcare coordination activities included not just referral systems that connected patients with appropriate care providers, but also resource-sharing arrangements that ensured equitable access to healthcare supplies and expertise, and communication systems that shared information about treatment options and outcomes.
Systems that transmitted healthcare knowledge and innovations across community and professional networks, the healthcare record-keeping systems that supported these networks were remarkably sophisticated, involving systematic documentation of treatment approaches, patient outcomes, and therapeutic innovations that supported both individual patient care and collective learning about effective healthcare practices. The daily healthcare documentation activities included not just individual patient records, but also systematic observation and recording of health patterns, treatment effectiveness, and community health conditions that informed both immediate care decisions and long-term healthcare planning and development. The preventive healthcare approaches that Egyptian communities developed reveal their sophisticated understanding of how environmental, social, and behavioral factors affected health outcomes. They didn't just treat health problems after they occurred, they actively worked to prevent problems through community-wide interventions that addressed the underlying causes of health challenges. The daily healthcare documentation activities included environmental health measures that protected water supplies, food safety practices that prevented foodborne illnesses, and community sanitation systems that reduced the spread of infectious diseases. But they also included social support systems that addressed the psychological and emotional factors that affected physical health. The community health education programs that supported preventive health care weren't just information-sharing sessions. They were comprehensive learning experiences that taught people how to maintain their own health while also contributing to community health and well-being.
The daily health education activities included both formal instruction and informal learning opportunities that helped people understand how their individual health practices affected both their personal well-being and the health of their families and communities. The mental health care approaches that Egyptians developed reveal their understanding of the psychological and emotional dimensions of human well-being. They recognized that mental and emotional health were essential components of overall health that required systematic attention and support, just like physical health conditions. The daily mental health care practices included individual activities that supported emotional balance and psychological well-being, but also social activities that provided community support and connection that were essential for mental health maintenance. The community mental health care resources included counseling services that helped people address psychological challenges, social support systems that provided assistance during difficult life transitions, and cultural activities that promoted emotional expression and psychological healing. The daily mental health care activities of communities included monitoring for signs of psychological distress, providing supportive interventions that addressed emotional challenges, and maintaining the social connections and cultural practices that supported optimal mental health for all community members. The integration of Egyptian healthcare systems with other aspects of daily life created comprehensive support systems that addressed human well-being holistically, rather than fragmenting care into isolated specialties that addressed individual symptoms without considering broader health contexts. The daily healthcare activities weren't separate from work, family, and community responsibilities. They were integrated into all aspects of life in ways that supported optimal functioning, while also maintaining the social connections and meaningful activities that were essential for comprehensive well-being. This integrated approach to healthcare created individuals who were not just free from disease, but actively healthy and capable of contributing effectively to family and community life. It also created communities that were resilient, adaptive, and capable of maintaining health and well-being even during challenging periods or difficult circumstances. The Egyptian approach to integrating healthcare with daily life offers insights that remain relevant for modern people seeking to create comprehensive health systems that support both individual well-being and community resilience in sustainable and effective ways. But healthcare was just one component of broader social support systems that addressed the full range of human needs and challenges that affected individual and community well-being. Egyptian communities developed comprehensive social safety nets that provided assistance and support for people experiencing various types of difficulties, while also maintaining the social cohesion and mutual responsibility that made these support systems sustainable over long periods.